If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Outdoorsmen, campers, and hikers, what are the creepiest things or otherworldly creatures you've seen in the deep woods, on trails, or in forests? The Florida Everglades in the 70s. My mom saw a Bigfoot in the Florida Everglades back in the 70s. Actually, many people in Florida call them swamp apes, but many also just refer to them as Bigfoot. She doesn't like to tell people what she saw because she knows they will pass her off as crazy. Anyway, my stepdad was an avid hunter and fisherman, and he had this giant swamp buggy thing. Looked like an overgrown tractor or bulldozer to me. The thing was huge. Anyhow, he liked to go off the beaten path and into the deep woods and marshlands to explore with it. So my mom would go with him a lot of times, and one time they were deep in these rarely driven dirt roads and trails off of Alligator Alley. My mom, being in the passenger seat, said she was sitting with her head turned toward the right, just looking at the woods next to her, as they were slowly driving along, and as they passed by a road, or trail, to her right, she said she saw this tall, hairy ape-person-looking thing with very long arms crossing that road, going the same direction they were going. She immediately told my stepdad what she saw, and he said that, well, there have been a lot of Bigfoot sightings in the area, but it was probably just a bear or something. She accepted this and figured she was just imagining it, being that she didn't believe in Bigfoot. About a minute after that, my stepdad said he had to go to the bathroom, so he parked the thing in the middle of the road, hopped off, and walked into the wood line to do his thing. My mom sat there waiting, and up ahead she saw the thing again. It turned out to be a Bigfoot, not a bear. She had a better view this time. She said it was at least 7 feet tall, covered in hair, and had arms almost to its knees and took very long strides. She said it walked out of the woods and crossed the road into the woods on the other side, like before. She immediately started freaking out and screamed for my stepdad. He came running out, she told him what she saw, but it was already gone. Said he believes her, though, as again, there were several reported sightings around that time. They moved up to where she saw it. He got down and looked around but didn't see anything. He later went back to the same area a few times but didn't find anything. The whistle in the forest. One day I and my friend went through a forest to some swings near my house. I was excited since I usually was bored at home and had no life, but anyways, so we got to the swings, and then after a little bit, we heard an almost scream-like whistle. So she is a person who gets scared easily, but I told her that it was just a bird or something, so then she calmed down, but then we heard another whistle only closer to us. Well, by then she said, "Let's go." I said no, it was just her mind playing tricks, and I said that I wouldn't let anything happen to her, but anyways, I got worn out of her whining, so I said, "Let's head home," so we were not even halfway in the forest, and then there it was, another creepy whistle that sounded really close. Well, by then, me and her booked it out of the forest, and I said, "Okay, let's take the long way." Well, by then, we were finally on the same page. We both looked at each other while walking, and I said, "What was that whistle?" And, well, she said, "I didn't hear a whistle, I heard a scream." Well, of course. I thought, well, that is just because you were already scared. To this day, I still believe it was a whistle, but what do I know? So we got home exhausted and weak. We both couldn't stop talking about that incident, but anyways, once we got home, we were okay. I'm just glad we didn't stay in that forest to find out what that whistle really was. So when I was younger, roughly 9 to 12, my family and I lived basically in the middle of nowhere in West Virginia. If anyone knows where Lincoln County is, you know it's a very rural area. Anyways, we lived way back on an isolated dirt road we call a holler where I'm from. Let me explain the layout so you'll understand later on. On much of this road, there was a stream that ran through the middle of the dirt road, basically forming a creek that we just drove to get to our driveway. There were 2 large holes of water specifically right at the end of our driveway, forming a type of pothole, so to speak. As young ones, my sister and I would play and splash around in these holes on the hot summer days. On this particular day my stepmom allows my sister and me to play out in the creek. We were excited seeing that we didn't get to do that very often, because of my mother's fear of us getting bit by a copperhead or rattler. We were having a great time, splashing around, shooting water pistols at each other, and sitting in these roughly hip-height pools of water. Suddenly, I saw something that will forever remain in my memory. Even at the age of 19, I can still vividly recall this sight as if it were the day I first saw it. I first noticed the shape of it, just ahead, peering from behind a pine tree around 35 yards from us in the shadows on a bank above us. I didn't know how to react at first. It was solid black, with skin like worn leather that was just conditioned, shiny, but still obviously worn. I could see the whites of its eyes, no hair on its head. It took one step, and I stood up out of the creek. I watched it as it walked towards us. Like a skinny man, just a normal, steady walk without taking its eyes off us. It was around 5 feet 8 inches 6'0". As the summer sun beamed hot rays, we both saw it clearly. I panicked and just ran, leaving my 5-year-old sister behind, me being roughly 10. I heard her scream and looked back as we watched it cross the stream and onto the next bank and into the forest. Of course our parents didn't believe us. Why would they? We didn't want to be anywhere near that creek again, and it took a long time for us to get over what we saw. Just that hairless, naked, solid black figure still gives me chills to this day. I now hunt in those very same woods, and I've never had an encounter with this thing again, nor honestly do I want to. Friends saw a black, dog-like creature with glowing eyes. It was 2021-22. We would walk down to a school in the summer sometimes. This happened in 2021 with 2 friends. They saw a creature and bolted. I never got a description from the 2, but with some other friends during summer 2022, the 2 saw this creature behind bushes. One of them, who is pretty tough, had a scratch on his back. He was petrified. Both of them pointed, yelled, and panicked. We eventually ran. This happened a few times. I couldn't see it. One of them drew me a picture of it a few months ago. It had horns, a black body, and it could stand. It had a wolf-like face with white glowing eyes. This always happened in the daytime. The situation became tense when one of my friend's brothers confided in me and another friend about seeing a cougar with a black body and horns. My friend and I looked at each other. We told his brother, the other friend, about his encounter. I forget his reaction. One of them still sees it to this day. And he still reacts with fear. I remember hearing a man yelling from that forest at night. The worst part? That forest is near my house. Like across the street and behind the house on the opposite side. I checked out the area, and nothing appears, but the feeling of dread is always there. Uwharrie National Forest, creeped out. This happened many years ago, and I didn't think too much about it at the time. Since then, I have read the 411 Missing books and listened to David Paulides podcasts. I used to hike/walk trails by myself, because I don't like to wait for someone to decide they want to go too, etc. I don't go alone anymore. My husband, who is retired from the military, is not afraid of much and is very aware of situational awareness. This was probably in the late 80s. We decided to go hiking at the Uwharrie National Forest. It isn't too much of a drive, and we weren't going overnight. We didn't bring any cell phones, and I may have brought a small film camera instead of a digital one. Honestly, it was so long ago, I don't remember the trail name. We get there, and there are no other trucks/cars in the parking lot. We also didn't see any other people. We are walking, enjoying nature, and talking. We had hiked a couple of hours. We come to a fork in the trail and decide to go left. The trail went slightly uphill, and there was a small footbridge across a stream. We decided this would be a good turning around point. We get to the bridge, maybe 3 feet wide at most. I am looking in the stream for fish or whatever else there might be. I notice that I don't hear any birds or forest sounds and remark to my hubby that it is really quiet and peaceful here. It is very thick with trees, but the trail is fairly well maintained. I see a movement in the trees and think it is probably a deer, very common in that area. Hubby is looking around, and suddenly he says, "We need to go now." I know him well enough not to argue. We hurry back to the parking lot and truck. As we are going back, hubby keeps looking behind us, and a few times, he walks backward and watches the trail behind us. We are finally closer to the parking lot and a few other people. Once we got safely in the truck, I asked him, what was that all about? He said he felt like there was someone or something there watching and following us. He stated that the object remained just out of sight in the trees, yet he could sense movement. Hubby isn't one to overreact, but he was definitely upset that day. Once we got closer to the truck and the people, he said that whatever disappeared back into the forest. We haven't been back, ever, to the Uwharries. There have now been reports of Bigfoot in that area. I didn't see anything that day, and all hubby felt was a presence, but I trust his instincts. The local beast. I'm an 18-year-old male from Cleveland, Texas. The city is quite small, and our school district only just became a 4A district, which, for those of you who don't know what 4A means, just states the size of the district. 4A is a middle-sized district. Anyway, with how small the city is, I'm sure you can imagine the rumors that go around. Especially seeing as if you know one person, you practically know everyone. So there is one rumor that a lot of the elders believe. And to be honest, I think I do too. Especially after what I'm about to tell you. So according to the stories the elders tell of the forest surrounding the city, there is a beast man. I'll share a story I heard when I was young. About the year 1997, there was a couple that decided to go hunting in the woods surrounding the city. They said that they would be out there for 4 days. After a day and a half, the wife decided she didn't like the outdoors and informed her husband that she was going home. He told her that was fine and he would be back on the 4th day and that if she came looking for him, his camp would not move. So the wife gathered her things and went home. She had gone about her daily life up until the 4th day, in which the husband had never come home. So, like any normal person, she got worried and went to the camp. And keep in mind that this was a time when phones were still bricks and not very popular. After arriving at the camp, she found everything normal. The fire had been put out, and all the gear was packed and ready to go. What was unusual was the absence of her husband. He wasn't there. She had called his name several times to no avail. Finally, she went back to town to get help. She drove to the local police station and got help from a family friend in the force. After looking for a whole day and still being unable to find her husband, they filed a missing person report and sent a search party the next day. Towards the end of that day, someone had found him dead. His clothes were torn in two. He had lacerations all over him. His chest was hollowed out from the bottom of the ribcage all the way up to his sternum. His stomach had been ripped open. Where they found him was in a nest. Apparently the nest looked like a buzzard's nest but was big enough for 4 grown men to sit in it and on the ground. There were bones everywhere, even strung in the trees like wind chimes. There was an investigation launched that day. The lacerations looked to be those of a large cat. The eaten-out stomach and chest were said to be the work of a dog. During the time the scene was being investigated, police reported seeing strange things in the woods, like a person watching them from just beyond the tree line and then it disappearing and seeing an animal where they last saw it. Each time being a different animal. They also reported hearing what sounded like a person trying to roar like a bear and howl like a wolf all in one go. The local police force was unable to figure out what had killed the man. They also tried to cover up the investigation. But with the town being so small, things don't go unnoticed. Skipping forward 12 years, I decided to go camping with a couple of friends out in those same woods. We were planning on staying out there for 3 days, but it got cut short. It was the first night, and we were all sitting around the fire talking about video games. One in particular was an RPG called Skyrim. Suddenly, a man, dressed in an orange vest and carrying a hunting rifle, approached us. He explained that he was out hunting for pigs and asked us to remain silent so as not to disturb him or frighten the animals. So as the unarmed people we were, we politely said yes and all went to sleep. The sound of the hunter's gun woke us in the middle of the night. We heard the gun go off 3 times in a row, back to back, before it subsided. We all shrugged it off and went back to sleep. Or, that's what I thought. Apparently one of the 2 guys I was with decided he was too nervous to go back to sleep. In the morning we all decided to gather our things and head out. We didn't want to stay out there so long as there was someone hunting so close by. The local Cleveland News reported the story 3 days later. They had reported a story of a hunter found dead in the woods, mauled by an unknown creature, lying in a very large nest surrounded by bones. A picture of the deceased was the same man we saw that night. I had called the guys I was with that night and told them about this new information. The one that had stayed up that night had told me he heard what sounded like a very high-pitched roar while we were all asleep. He said he didn't tell us because he didn't want to freak us out. When he said that, I instantly remembered the story of the couple back in 1997. I never believed that story until now. Don't take the stories your grandparents tell you for granted. Not only are those stories their legacy, but they're also their advice and warnings to us younger generations. I want to start off by saying I'm bad at typing stories, so sorry for the misspelling. It's also like 3 a.m. for me. Anyways, I recently went on a fishing trip with my buddy, and we decided to go to a lake we found on Google Maps, way off the trail we always take for walks. We walked through the woods for about 3 hours, this will make sense later, and by the time we got there, it was already sunset. Now, my buddy is really into Bigfoot and brought one of those thermal cameras because he wanted to see if he could find anything. Anyways, after some drinking and a little fishing, we both got in our tent, we were sharing, and fell asleep. About an hour later, I think, my buddy woke me up, saying something about screaming and a weird howl. I told him he was probably dreaming from the drinking, until I heard it too. I won't lie, I nearly shit myself. I've heard coyotes and wolves, and I've never heard anything like that before. My buddy was freaking out because we left the fire burning, and it was still making light. So he asked me to go put it out. I was like, hell no, and told him to go out with me. He came out with that dumb camera and started looking around. After a few minutes of us standing around, drunk and in our underwear, he says, "I found him." I asked him what he was talking about, and he pointed into the trees and gave me the camera. I looked in and saw a person on all fours about 100 yards away, looking right at me. I nearly had a heart attack. We were like 3 hours away from anything, and we weren't staying there. So we hatched a plan. He went in and got our stuff packed while I kept an eye on this person with the camera. Then we would make a run for it. A few minutes into this standoff, my friend started saying he needed help looking for something. Now, this person hadn't moved, so I went into the tent to help him get our stuff. By the time we got out and were ready to leave, I looked back through the camera, and the person was gone. We ducking ran like kids. We didn't pack the tent, and I left 2 of my rods. I didn't care, to be honest. After like 10 minutes, we heard that scream again. But this time, we heard a childlike voice scream. "Help me. I'm lost and scared. Please help me." My buddy looked through the camera in the direction of the scream and swears the person was there, peeking from behind a tree, staring right at us, and then started running straight at us. We had flashlights and threw them away. We ran even faster. I don't know if we were followed, because after we saw it run at us, we both didn't want to look through that camera again. We just ran, stopping to breathe every few minutes. I even puked at one point. After what felt like a lifetime of running, we made it to my car. After a quick sweep of the woods to make sure we weren't followed, I went to my door to open it, only to find a goddamn teddy bear head on the ground. We got out of there. I drove drunk, I didn't care. I wasn't staying there. We talked to the police and forest rangers and never heard anything besides, it was probably a crackhead. But I don't know. The way that person followed us, like a dog, it still freaks me out. I've never gone back there, and honestly, I probably never will. Never camp in the woods unless you can defend yourself. So if you haven't noticed, the woods in general are just weird. I think that's anywhere, though. And when you're in them, they do a good job of letting you know that you're unnatural. Almost like the whole thing is alive and constantly tricking you left and right. Rain in the forest can sound like footsteps when falling off a tree branch. Every creature there except for you is camouflaged, unless you're wearing camo, yidukni, and everything else avoids you like a plague. But all in all, it's a breeze to just feel safe there if you're not paranoid. The older I get, the more I've come to almost fear it, simply because my older mind can think up way more possibilities about what could go wrong or what could be out there. But when you're a kid, the woods are about as scary as your bedroom. When I was super young, probably 5 or 6, my grandparents would always tell me stories about a panther in the woods. They told me one time that they saw it in their headlights while pulling into the driveway even. They swore their life on it. I took it with a grain of salt, but as I got older, the less I really believed it to be true at all. A damn panther? In MS, that's Mississippi, US for my non-US friends? That never bothered to kill our chickens, pigs, sheep, birds, cats, dogs, or other animals? That were just free for the taking, basically trapped in an easily jumpable fence? It became so not feasible that I just never thought about it again. It wasn't until 2 years ago that I heard the big boy, or girl, speak. My brother and I were on the front porch having a smoke sesh of nature's best, Guckagong 420 blazite.jpg, and watching The Office on Netflix via his iPhone. Then we heard a long, drawn-out howl, then another, then the entire freaking neighborhood of dogs and coyotes. This happens quite a bit, actually, real ducking annoying, TBH. About 5 minutes into this impromptu, doggone chorus, there came a loud scream that split all the noise in half and ended in that little growl all big cats give when they roar. Immediately my brother and I started looking up videos on what it could be. Bobcat scream? Nope. Cougar scream? Not quite either. Panther scream? Hell ducking, yeah, that's it. This ducked me up for one reason: I spent my entire childhood miles deep in those same woods. And I was a chubby kid too, I would have been good at eating. I haven't doubted my grandparents' stories since. Now before I get hit with a bunch of actualies, yes, I know that panthers aren't their own big cat species and are just a melanistic big cat variant. So it could be jaguar, leopard, tiger, etc. Perhaps this story scares me because it was only my life at risk, but I think about it often. Anything can exist in those woods, even species you wouldn't consider native. The thing. So my friend has a small patch of woods behind his house, and we went exploring, and he asked, "What if we see a bear?" To which I responded, "We play dead or run." After that, we see footprints, and he says, "See the bear?" I say, "No, those aren't bears, those are doggos." He was like, "You're right." Then the footsteps drew nearer to us, growing louder as they approached. We ran, then we took a break, and then it was a blur of fur about 7 feet tall. We were scared, and I said, "Let's stay." We had knives, but it kept getting louder and louder, so we ran. We told his parents. They grabbed a knife and checked. They told us not to go there again because they saw the prints, so we went again. Same thing. We still talk about it, and I did research. There have been reports of a creature attacking in the woods. I was so nervous I screenshotted and shared it with him. He said, "OMG, I'm in the woods again," and ran. He was fine, just scratches from branches, so we never went back until we did, but we saw more prints towards his house. We told everyone there, they checked, they were there, they told us to lock the doors and windows, and they would check. They ran back, and we let them in, they were bleeding. If you don't believe, that's fine. I'm also new to this. I need to add the last part. My friend calls me, reports that he is bleeding in the woods, and sends me a picture. Also, it could be Photoshop, but it was way too realistic, so I went over. He was bleeding, and we heard the screech of an animal, so we looked out the window. The bear-like figure was there. We have only ever heard stories of werewolves. Never am I going to forget this terrifying event. The forest puppet. I've only had a handful of encounters I personally cannot explain, and this one troubles me the most. I apologize if this story doesn't have much fluff. I try to get straight to the point when writing down experiences. I live in a rural area in New England, and nothing out here really bothers me. I've seen black bears and coyotes and have become used to the wildlife in the area by living out here for 17 years. But whenever you get used to something, Mother Nature always tends to mess it up. It was a warm summer day in July, and I decided to take my horse, Cheyenne, down a forested trail on my grandparents' property. We've completed this trail many times, with no issues, so I thought nothing of it at the time. I tacked up, and started down the trail in mid-afternoon, the heat and flies already getting to my horse and I. When trail riding, you tend to lose track of time, you study the forest and listen to the noises all around you, and that's what I did. As we carried on down the trail, I noticed my mare became increasingly nervous and reluctant to move forward. I encouraged her the best I could, but I started to notice a change in the forest. It was like a mood swing, the forest noises seemed to dim, which put me on edge. Up ahead of us was a sharp wooded corner, so I couldn't see what was up ahead. The logical side of me was screaming, "I've listened to scary narrations, this simply wasn't a good situation." The stubborn side of me, however, was encouraged to round the corner, and with my horse on edge, I did. The forest was now silent, and dread consumed me, but I rounded the corner. In front of me was a decently dressed man in the middle of the trail, but he just seemed off. His motions were almost mechanical, I dare say robotic. He lurched backwards, he didn't jump back, it was like something pulled his body back. It was almost like it wanted to act surprised or shocked that I was there, it just didn't look natural, he looked like a puppet. At that moment my mind was screaming. No one was supposed to be out there, no one should be out there. This was private property, in the middle of nowhere. This trail wasn't even connected or near to main roads, strangers couldn't access it. I didn't get a good look at his face, I could feel myself avoiding looking at it, as if even the thought of it unnerved me. His clothing, as I recall, just seemed average, nothing special, but his presence made me physically sick. I've never had so much dread come over me, a person shouldn't instill that much fear in someone. As if my horse sensed my dread, she turned quickly around and bolted back down the trail as if spooked herself, and we headed back to the barn. As I got to the end of the trail and saw the barn, I felt everything lift, the forest noises came back, and most of the fear drifted away. I could finally breathe. I had never untacked a horse that quickly in my life. I had to walk past the trail to make it to my grandparents' house, and I dreaded it. I got on the phone with my mom as I made my way down the dirt road to the house. I boasted to her about how I saw a deer on the trail, trying to not make my voice crack, as I walked past it. I was too afraid to reveal the truth about what I saw, or even to take a glance back at it. Once I passed the trail, I sprinted the rest of the way, almost like an invisible boogeyman was behind me. I don't fear the woods, I don't fear people, but that man, or whatever it was, terrified me. He said nothing, but he could still instill so much instinctive dread and fear in me. My horse sensed it. A person has never spooked her, but that thing did. I don't know what that was, but the motions were not human. Please, everyone, be careful in the woods, and never get too comfortable. That's when the strangest encounters happen. Update. I thought I wouldn't have to deal with any weirdness for a while, but I've been recently proven wrong. My front steps were just recently repaired, and no person nor dog was allowed on them for 2 days. So I had to take my dogs out on a leash in my backyard rather than in the front yard. This does come into play. I did this throughout the day with no issue. That was until nightfall, that is. I took my Mastiff out, her name is Bella, and she's simply quite intimidating to look at. Which could explain why this oddity didn't escalate. The pitch black night didn't seem to faze me with my dog at my side. However, Bella was taking her good old time, and my patience was running thin, being that the cold wind was feeling like needles at this point. She pulled me down further into the backyard, closer to the woods, and in a place that blocked out the view of our house's porch. At this point I was irritated and done, having been out there for around 15 minutes at this point. That was until I heard a clear voice that sounded close but also semi-far off. It was a male voice, and it simply said, "Can you help me?" At first this didn't faze me, since I was thinking it was my father and his worker talking to each other in the front yard. And Bella didn't even acknowledge it, and she's quite protective. I simply ignored it even though I was on edge, since the voice sounded so much like my father's worker. So I urged Bella to go back toward the light on the porch, and we eventually went back in. When I entered the house, I was greeted by my mother sitting at the kitchen table eating. I simply asked her if my father and his worker were home, and she gave me a puzzled look. Apparently they weren't home, and they haven't been for an hour. I asked her multiple times, and she still confirmed they weren't home. The only reason I believe this is connected is because I live right next door to my grandparents, which is where the first incident occurred. They're my only neighbors for miles, and dense forest separates our two properties, the same forest that I had my first encounter in. I don't know what this is, and I don't know what I should do. Why I hate the woods. Since I was 5 or 6, and I'm now 18, I have lived on a caravan site with my grandparents surrounded by woods. Until I was about 12, I didn't have any friends, so I never got to go into the woods unless I was walking the dog with my nan. The summer after I turned 12, I started hanging out with the other kids on the site. My best friend, who I will call Ben, and I used to spend all our time up there either alone or with our big friendship group. One day it was just me, Ben, and one of our other friends, and we went up to our favorite spot in the woods. We sat there talking and smoking for a while until I had to go in for dinner. It was only a 5-minute walk from this spot to the entrance of the woods. I would like to point out it was about 5 p.m. in August, so it was still daylight. Ben and our other friend ran in front of me, and I slowly walked behind them. They had gone the long way back, so I walked the normal way, and we could meet in the middle. They had gotten so far in front that I couldn't even hear them anymore, and that made me feel uncomfortable. I have never felt at ease in those woods alone, and I would always experience a negative sensation when I entered them. It was then the footsteps started. They were quite close behind me, and so I turned around, and nothing was there. I assumed it was just a badger and carried on, but as I did, the footsteps got closer. I was still refusing to let myself freak out, and so I carried on once again. A few steps later, and I got the scare of my life. I felt a human hand on my shoulder. I screamed and sprinted away, and as I did, I looked back and couldn't see anything. I know what I felt was not a tree, and I know there wasn't anyone in the trees. I haven't been alone up there since. Although that doesn't mean I haven't had other experiences. One day it was just me and Ben when we heard a bike bell and the bike wheels getting closer, but as it should have passed, there was just a large gust of wind. And then there was the time I was looking for Ben with another of our friends. We took 2 steps into the woods as it was dark before we both began to cry. Something was wrong, and I think we would have seen the worst of the wood spirits if we hadn't left. Haunted Triangle Road. I was 26 years old, and I was out at a nightclub with some friends because they needed someone to drive their drunk butt home later, and honestly, I love to drive. The club didn't close until 2 a.m., and as part of our tradition, we always made a stop at a fast food restaurant. There, surrounded by our entire crew, we began to engage in conversation, which naturally led us to discuss ghost encounters. I stayed silent most of the time because some stories were just too unreal to be real. But we end up packing up 2 cars with people to go ghost hunting. We drove to our usual haunted places, but we saw nothing. As the time approached 3 a.m., I began to feel bored and tired. Then, my friend Johnny suggested that we drive to a road shaped like a triangle, where it was said that every lap you took would trigger strange and frightening events. I smiled and said, "Okay, let's drive this supposedly haunted triangle." To find this road, you have to drive straight out into a forest, and it took us 1 hour until we were on that road and we started lap 1. So about the triangle, it is said that witches got buried inside the triangle, and that is why it is said to be haunted. In the middle of the first lap, we paused because some boys wanted to demonstrate their bravery by venturing into the forest. However, This was a foolish decision, as they risked attracting a bad spirit and potentially bringing it home with them. After some fooling around, I start to drive, and I begin lap 2. Nothing stood out from the others, but I sensed a problem. My back began to ache, but I chose to ignore it. After I begin with lap 3, we start to hear the sound of running on the side of the car, but we see nothing on the side. After about 10 minutes, I began to experience increased back pain, and as we transitioned into our 4th lap, the situation deteriorated significantly for both myself and the others. We started to hear dogs barking like they were running along the car, but we saw nothing, and the air in the car started to get colder even if I had heat on. I start to regret that I said yes to this trip, and we were going in on the 5th lap, and I start to hear someone whisper in my ear in the back of the car, and when I look in the rearview mirror, I see a black smoke sitting in the middle seat, and instantly the pain gets worse in my back, and it starts to spread over my whole body. It felt like someone was trying to bend my back as if trying to break it and push my bones out of my own body. But I try to ignore it and keep driving. I turn the mirror so I don't have to see that shadow. I don't remember so much more of the other laps. No matter how hard I try, I just can recall the pain in my body, and we did 13 laps. We finished the 13th lap with me crying in pain because it got so bad, and the moment we left the area where the triangle was, my body just stopped hurting like it never happened, and the smoke shadow was gone too. Needless to say, I never drove back on those roads ever again, and I stayed with a firm no when I got asked to do the drive again. I'm not putting my health in that way ever again. Back in the day, when I was in college, I and the oldest took off to a lake in the wilds of Glacier Country. I have extensive backcountry exposure. I even did a stint as a big game guide in a remote backcountry camp. On this day we enjoyed the fishing and settled in for the night. I pulled out my pan and stoked up a nice fire. It was clear and cool as the sun faded over the western slopes. We cooked up some fresh rainbow trout with garlic and butter and filled our stomachs. I leaned back against the cooler after pulling out a refreshing beverage. The boy was soon asleep by the fire as it had been a busy day. I sipped my beer and watched the moonlight bouncing off the little waves in the lake. There was still a light glow on the western horizon where the sun had gone down, and I could see the outline of the mountain peaks towering over the little lake. I slowly faded off to sleep with the sound of the lake waves gently lapping on the rocks. I was startled awake. The fire was out, the lantern was out too. The moon was gone, and it was pitch black. Something was wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight out. I was paralyzed. I could hear my heart thumping as I strained to hear something in the bush. All was quiet. I had a horrible, uneasy feeling. I gathered myself together and started kicking around the fire. A small flame came alive, and I quickly threw on some wood. In the firelight I could see that the boy had awoken and was shocked to see his wide-open eyes staring at me. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing, go climb the tent." I lied. He crawled into the tent, but even in the light of fire, I couldn't shake my wariness. Something was out there in the bush, and I could feel it was watching me. I gathered up my light and flashed it around camp. Nothing. Finally, I began to calm down and crawled in the tent with the boy. Then again, like clockwork, I awoke completely tense. This time I couldn't shake the feeling at all. I finally instructed the boy to wake up and go get in the truck. I packed up all of camp and drove around to the other side of the lake and slept with him in the truck. When I woke up at dawn and looked across the lake where we had camped earlier, I experienced another uneasy feeling. I decided it was time to go home. I didn't know what was going on, but my instincts told me something was wrong with that place. Whatever it was, I will leave it to your imagination. It creeps me out to this day thinking about that night. Slenderman trauma. Okay, so I was 12 years old and was in 7th grade. Back in 7th grade I was a big daredevil, and my friends always got me to do stuff that they'd never even thought about doing, like getting out of my seat and saying stuff behind the teacher's back while he wasn't looking. As you can tell, I was sort of a troublemaker in the eyes of the teachers. It was 2010, and Slenderman was pretty popular then, and one of my friends was a huge fan of it. One day after school she came to my house, and we had a sleepover since it was the weekend. But at around 10 p.m., she dared me to go with her in the forest to look for Slenderman. I didn't and still don't believe in Slenderman, so I said yes since I didn't expect to see anything out there. My dad was really strict, so I had to sneak around him since, up to my freshman year of high school, he made me go to bed at 9 p.m. We got some flashlights and snuck out the back door since my dad was in the bathroom and my stepmom had already gone to bed. At the time I lived at the end of our town, and around that area was a lot of forest, so it only took us a couple of minutes to reach the forest. We both turned on our flashlights and went in. She was excited and was hoping to find at least something out there, but I didn't really care and just didn't do this since she was my friend. It was dark outside, and the deeper we went into the forest, the more my house disappeared out of sight. After my house came out of sight, I told my friend that I wanted to go back, and she said okay. But as we began to walk back in the direction of my house, we didn't see my house at all. Just more forest. We began to run but still more forest. After about an hour of running around calling the names of my family, we knew we were lost. I and my friend got extremely worried, and at this point we were both running around, calling my family's names, and hoping to find a house or something. After another hour, we gave up and rested by a tree. I wanted to cry but didn't since I didn't want to make my friend even more worried than she already was. After a couple more minutes, we got back up and began walking hopelessly forward until my friend pointed to the top of a nearby mountain to what appeared to be a small, old house. We ran to the hill and began racing up the hill. Even after we got tired, we were tired and hungry and hoped that whoever lived here would help. After a long run up the hill, I knocked on the door, and nobody answered. The house looked creepy, though. It looked old and dirty like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The roof had a huge dent in it, and there were no lights on in the house. Not to mention there were several curtains hung up, and the windows were boarded up from the inside. I gave up, but my friend didn't, and she began to bang on the door as hard as she could, and the door budged open. We walked in, and it appeared to be abandoned. There were cobwebs everywhere, and the floors were littered with trash and candy wrappers and even some weapons like guns and knives. My friend grabbed my hand and forced me to follow her around the house. The only other room was a bedroom and a kitchen. The bedroom door was boarded up, and the kitchen was a mess, with pots and pans thrown everywhere and even some shit on the floor. The fridge was open and had smears of what seemed to be spaghetti sauce and dried mashed potatoes on the walls of the fridge. I and my friend, after searching for a little while, found a little handle that, after you pulled, opened the attic. A ladder came down from the attic, and we climbed up it. It was extremely dark, so we turned on our flashlights and were scared for our lives. Notes covered the walls, and boxes were everywhere, most of them having VHS tapes and DVDs, even though VHS tapes were way old-fashioned for this era. Clothes were everywhere on the floor, and the attic window was boarded up with muddy handprints on the glass. But then my friend opened another box and screamed at the top of her lungs. I ran over and was terrified at what I saw. It was a dog skull and a human spine, and a crap ton of notes stuffed into the corner of the box. We immediately climbed down the attic ladder and ran out, running down the hill and back into the forest. We just ran, not turning back to that house. After what seemed like an eternity, my house came back into sight. We ran as fast as we could, and as we came closer and closer, we could see cop cars parked at the house. Cops were in the front yard talking to my dad and stepmom. I explained everything to the cops, and the cops escorted my friend home, and as for me, I was grounded for a whole month, and my dad made me promise to never go back into the forest again. I promised. My dad became more protective of me since then, and a couple of months after the incident, we moved to a different town and never spoke of the incident since. It still lingers on in my brain sometimes, and I still can't imagine what had to happen there for somebody to have a dog's skull in someone's spine. Whatever it was terrifying, and I hope that whoever did that was arrested. Weird camping experience. I am new to the group and wanted to share an experience I had back in the spring of 2018. My life has had several paranormal experiences, but this was the most recent and unsettling. I am an avid outdoorsman and love to hunt and camp around the Francis Marion and Sumter National Forest. Back in 2018, I took my young son and dog out to a remote area in the National Forest to test out a new camper shell on my recently purchased truck. We found a secluded area off a dirt road, made dinner, and then packed it in for the night as soon as it got dark. Around 11 p.m. at night, I sat up and looked out the back of the truck due to my dog growling. In the distance I saw what looked like hundreds of small white balls of light darting around, then hovering for a few seconds and slowly converging to our campsite. They looked just like the dust orbs you see on videos, but these were producing light in a completely dark forest. They soon surrounded my truck. Seemed like hundreds of them. They were a soft white light, and they didn't blink. Lightning bugs were out early evening, but those were yellow and blinking. After 30 minutes of them floating around and concentrating around us, I finally worked up the nerve to open the truck and lit a lantern, and they promptly disappeared. After turning off the lights and locking back up, they came back. My son was fast asleep, thank goodness. I watched them until I finally fell asleep around 1 a.m. The next morning when we tried to leave, the battery was dead on the new truck. There weren't any lights in the back cab where we would have used any power. A week later I had to replace the electric control module. I'm uncertain if this information is pertinent, but I felt compelled to include it. Has anyone had a similar experience? Just thinking about them again makes the hair stand up on my neck. Camping killers. When I turned 13 a few years back, I invited a few friends of mine, 8 in total. The site we were camping at was near a large area of forest that had giant trees and lots of bushes. I think you can tell where this is going. The campsite was on the water, so we spent the 2 days we were there swimming, biking, and exploring the nearby woods. On our first day there, we were biking around the other campsites when we found a group of other kids our age. There were about 3 of them. Instead of getting along, we got into a pretty big argument, which basically made war between our 2 groups. At one point, one of the kids in their group threatened to hurt us with his dad's knife. This made us leave and head back to our camping site, as it deeply disturbed us and made us uncomfortable. That night was normal. We forgot about those kids and roasted s'mores. My mom and dad went to bed around 10, they were the only supervisors, and told us to not stay up too late and to not make too much noise. As we were messing around, I saw something in the corner of my eye. It looked like the shape of a human on the tree line near our campsite. I asked my friends, and we decided to go look at it up close. As we approached, we could definitely tell it was a person. The thing was they weren't moving. Standing dead still. As my friend, for the sake of this, I'll call him Matt, got next to the figure, he told it was a mannequin. We were all very confused by this, as it wasn't here earlier. Why would someone put a mannequin here? As we tried to figure out the answer to that question, we heard movement around us, coming from bushes nearby. We decided to dash back to camp, and once we all made it, we got into our giant tent and kept watching to see if anyone was coming. There was a point where my friend, Brody, saw a figure moving in the tree line. I caught a glimpse of it, but I'm still unsure if it was a person or not. We kept taking shifts of sleeping and watching for people. By the next morning we were all drained and decided to go check out the mannequin. As we approached the area where it was, we saw it gone without a trace. This also disturbed us, as it was about 5 in the morning, which meant someone must have come in the night to take it. We went back to check on the kids we fought with and saw that they were indeed still there. When they saw us coming, they quickly went into their camper van and hid. We tried to wait them out, but they didn't come out no matter what. Eventually we gave up and headed back to our site. Since it was still relatively early by that time, we decided to keep exploring the place where Brody may have seen a person. What we found next made us all want to leave and never go back. In a bush, right next to where Brody saw the figure, was a hunting knife, a pair of binoculars, and a hunting rifle. We assume it was those kids, but if it was, how did they get those items? That night was normal until about 11. We saw more movement in the trees and knew we had to be careful. We all stayed up and watched as multiple figures made their way through the trees. Eventually, Matt got mad, that's what I'm assuming, and decided to open the tent, shine his flashlight, and start yelling at whoever those people were. We followed after him as he moved closer towards the trees and caught a glimpse of 2 of the other kids booking it deep into the woods, carrying the items we found in the bush. We returned to the tent after we scared them off, and the rest of the night was uneventful, although that night none of us could sleep. Nothing more happened, as by the time we checked on the kids the next day, they had already left the campsite. That experience still haunts me, and I wonder what would have happened if we had been vulnerable in those woods that night. I thought of one other from 2019 that was kind of interesting, though not what I think of as creepy, more scary. In my spare time I look for old abandoned trails and try to map them with GPS before they are entirely lost to time. Just off of one trail I'm working to trace is a rocky knob where I think one of those roars I heard in 2012 originated, so I put trail cameras up there now and then in hopes that whatever it was would come back and I'd get its picture. So late last summer, when we thought fire season was done, we got one last late T-storm, which set a fire across the river canyon from my camera. I decided to retrieve it, sit on the outcropping, maybe watch the retardant drops, and try to suss out the trail a bit more. I was early, the planes were late, and the yellow jackets were swarming. I decided it was best to move onward. I relocated the trail and followed it up around the side of the hill, sometimes by groundwork, sometimes by old sawed log ends. I lost it in a steep hillside meadow. Rather than climb up the hill and over the ridge, then drop straight to the main trail, I decided to side hill, stay about level, and reconnect with the abandoned trail on the other side. I missed. I somehow lost track of how many side ridges to cross and ended up heading due south instead of east. Oops. I didn't know it for a couple of miles. Sun seemed in an odd position, but I didn't really think too hard about it. As I finally came around the end of the ridge, the timber started to thin a bit, and I could see out in front of me a wrong site. Sort of a basin with a big meadow about 1.5 miles away. I turned left, east, and came out on a steep dirt escarpment that looked to be a half-mile long, a couple 100 feet high, covered with scattered rocks, grass, and brush. Never been there before. And then the fire spotter plane went over my head and started circling. Big WTF moment. I got to wondering if a sleeper fire was popping up between me and the exit. After a few circles, the spotter plane moved off west across the canyon, but within 5 minutes or so, one of the big orange water-dropping helicopters with a snorkel started circling around a few 100 yards away above the trees, above me. After a few circles, it moved on, and I figured it was time to haul ass. I was getting a bit tired and didn't want to walk any farther than necessary, but I wanted to be away. I hit the bottom of that escarpment going down and left east and went into the timber. Somewhere about 200 yards below me, a little to the right, something whooped. I thought about the Bigfoot possibility since it is part of the area I research, but I was sure I was coming down on top of that main trail, so I assumed it was a hiker, ignored it, and kept on walking. Well, I hit that main trail all right, but only after walking about 2 miles around and down the mountain. Whoever or whatever that was, it was no hiker on the trail, I can guarantee that. The spooky part, though, was the spotter plane and the waterdrop helicopter. The notion of having a fire between me and my exit is one of the few things that I lose sleep over hiking in the Cascades in summer and fall. I saw a Wendigo, and I wish I hadn't. I need to write this down before I convince myself it didn't happen. This happened in December last year. I was visiting my uncle in northern Minnesota, near the Canadian border. He's the kind of guy who prefers solitude, lives in a cabin deep in the woods, no close neighbors, just the trees and whatever lives in them. I never minded visiting. I like the quiet. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever go back. It was the coldest night of the year, with a minimum temperature of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. My uncle had gone into town for supplies, so I was alone. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling, and I was scrolling on my phone when I heard it, something moving outside. Not footsteps. More like a dragging sound. Slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then came the knock. The knock was not at the door, but rather at the window. There were 3 slow, deliberate taps. I froze. My uncle's nearest neighbor was miles away, and no sane person would be out in that cold. The knocking came again. I reached for my flashlight and shined it through the window. I wish I hadn't. There was something standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, but emaciated, with long, bony limbs. Its skin looked frostbitten, almost blackened. And its eyes were glowing. Instead of reflecting light, its eyes were glowing on their own, akin to embers buried in a dying fire. I should have looked away. I should have closed the curtains. But I was frozen, staring, unable to breathe. And then, it smiled. Its teeth were too many and sharp, stretching across its face. It opened its mouth wider than any human should, and then it spoke. "Let me in." The voice didn't match the body. It sounded wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed, too deep, too garbled. I ran. I grabbed my uncle's rifle, locked the door, and backed into the farthest corner of the room. The knocking stopped, but I could hear it scraping against the walls outside. Slow, patient. It appeared as though it had all the time in the world. I sat there for what felt like hours, rifle shaking in my hands, until my uncle finally came back. The second his headlights swept across the trees, the noises stopped. He found me pale, sweating, and gripping the gun like my life depended on it. I told him everything. He didn't say a word, just nodded and checked around the cabin. When he came back, he looked unsettled. "There are no tracks in the snow," he said. "Nothing." That was impossible. I heard it. I saw it. But there was nothing outside. No footprints. There were no marks on the walls. Just the untouched snow and the silent, watching trees. I left the next morning and haven't been back since. My uncle still lives there, but he told me something before I left. "If you ever hear it again," he said, "don't look. And whatever you do, never let it in." I haven't told anyone else until now. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there. Strange sightings. This incident occurred to both me and 2 of my cousins. For privacy purposes, let's call them N and R. This happened when I was 11, and I've never been an outgoing or rebellious person. I've never done any drugs or had secret drinking sessions with friends at that time, and I still never have, and I know how crazy this sounds, but I swear to everything holy, this actually happened. My family and I were visiting my uncle and aunt on Easter, and that's important because I wholly believe it being Easter had an impact. You should know that my uncle had a riverside home, and by that I mean, his house sat on a cliff, so to speak, but had a long staircase going down to the river where he had a boat that could seat maybe 6 to 8 people, which includes the driver and a co-pilot, if you can call the second driver that. So my 2 cousins, me, my mom, and my aunt go for a ride on the boat. We go one way, which goes under the bridge on the main road, and in the distance, you can see some factories or businesses. It's when we went the other way that I saw something. Now on one side were the homes people lived in, had boats to take rides on or fish, and even swim if they wanted. On the other side was nothing but forest and the occasional tiny bits of land for fishermen. The forest is across the river, away from the main road and houses, and the river isn't huge, but it's big enough for small boats. As we're going towards the more narrow part of the river, I see something on the small bit of land nearby. 2 somethings, actually. On the left, the small island, or whatever it was a human-shaped figure all in black. Think of a shadow person. There is no face, no features, just pure blackness. On the other side, opposite the black shape, was a human shape but all white. No face, no features, just white. Both figures had a sort of glow around them, like angels have. I swear to God, I pointed them out to my cousins, and they swore to me they saw them too. N was probably 9 or 10, and R was probably 7 or 8, so we were never on anything or allowed to drink. I went to my church pastor because the idea of seeing something like that kind of scared me, and I was afraid that it could be something serious. At 10 I had dedicated my life to believing in God, so when I told my pastor, he told me I may have seen a devil and an angel. I should say, my grandmother was also there at my uncle's, and I think she said she'd felt God's spirit that day, and I've always looked up to her. I apologize if this isn't scary and it's kind of anticlimactic, not to mention not everyone will believe that I saw anything, much less celestial and hellish figures, but I've remembered that day for 20 years, and I honestly believe I did see an angel and a demon. The scary thing for me is that those figures came after I chose to follow Christ and that the devil was immediately trying to fight for my soul, while the angel was there to protect me. Whether you believe it or not, I think everyone has a guardian angel, or as we call it, a conscience, that keeps us on the straight and narrow. My grandmother is no longer around, so I can't really ask her about that day, and sometimes the thought of it makes me want to cry, as well as feel comforted because it makes me feel stronger in my faith, and that's all that matters to me. Cult activity. So my grandmother lives on a mountain in Northern California along with my 2 cousins, uncle, and grandfather. One day my uncle was driving up the hill to her house with his girlfriend, and when they were on the flats, the 2 saw a group of about 10 to 15 people holding hands in robes, chanting in tongues. Naturally, they sped up and drove past the house, not terrified but shaken. They never saw this particular experience again, but about a year later, my uncle broke up with his girlfriend because she was an addict, and he was done with drugs. But sorry, I digress. At this point my uncle had his own camper that was on my grandma's land, and he slept there at night and hung out in the house during the day, but one night he was asleep, it was about 1 p.m., and that first experience was always on his mind. But after about 30 minutes of feeling uncomfortable and unable to sleep, something started rubbing against the camper. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion or other animals that are common there, but he noticed it seemed oddly human-like, hands gliding across the plastic outer part of the camper. He was horrified but calm, and the thing soon stopped rubbing against it, and he shortly fell asleep. He immediately the next morning rushed inside and told my grandmother and other family there what had happened. Everyone didn't doubt his theory that it was a human because many of my family there had experiences similar, such as one of my 2 cousins was outside at night letting the dogs go to the bathroom as they couldn't run around unless supervised due to there being no fence and open forest everywhere and many dangerous animals. He was on the back porch watching them so they didn't wander away, and he said when he got back that he felt like he was being watched. Keep in mind I'm hearing all of these stories, and I'm very skeptical but also believing because my whole family hates lying and believes in the paranormal, and naturally, so do I. Then one night I decided to stay the night there and hang out with my family, and I went outside to get the rest of the things from the car, and I saw red eyes in the distance, not green, which is the color of mountain lions or other animals known to inhabit the area, so I was very scared and ran inside. They asked me what was wrong, and I told them I saw pupils and felt uneasy. They comforted me, as I was 11 at this point and a puss. Now we all suspected this place was also haunted because the former owner had died and my grandmother was renting it from his daughter. We would constantly hear our names, and when we asked who the person was who called our names, they were always confused as they hadn't called our names. I was never there alone, I was always there with my cousin. At the time, he was 14 and I was 12, and we both got an uneasy feeling and thought we saw a shadow, so we went into his room and watched a movie and played Black Ops 2 Zombies. Years later, I'm coming to understand that the man continued to inhabit the house even after his death. I recently did research on the mountain, and there is a lot of cult activity and paranormal happenings there. I now live in Missouri, where the majority of my family lives, and I texted my grandmother all the info I dug up. I also found information on old Chinese tunnels dug during the gold rush that were used to transport Chinese slaves. My grandmother is now moving out here along with everybody else, and we are all still shook even years later. In the summer of 2021, I was 16, and being a Mormon in Utah, I would go on yearly young men's camps. Well, this year we were going up to the north side of Bear Lake, closer to Idaho. We were going up for 5 days in July. When we got up there, it felt off, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, though I wrote it off as just being in the mountains and being paranoid. The first thing we did after getting set up was go on a hike. There was a trail that was kind of shaped like a horseshoe. It was very steep and unkempt. It took us till sunset to get back to camp. Once we got back, I realized I had left my camera at the highest point of the trail, also being the middle of it, so I decided to go up and grab it. On my own, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. In fact, I told them I was going to the bathroom because I was kind of embarrassed. On the way up the trail, I noticed how quiet it was, not even crickets. My footsteps sounded so loud. Once I got to the place I had left my camera, where it should have been lying on the path, it was hanging from a tree branch directly above the trail. I had to use a long stick to reach it. There was no way I could have put it there. I was, at the time, 5 feet 7 inches. This branch was at least 8 feet up. I was very on edge at this point, as I was heading back. I felt like I was being watched before hearing a metallic-like noise in the woods up the mountain. For context, the camp was at the base of this mountain, and there was a small plateau. With a clearing in the middle, the peak of that trail was in this clearing. Beyond the plateau was just steep forest with nothing in it. There was absolutely no way a car or anything could get up there. It's impossible. And no, it was not an echo. The mountain did not echo that loudly. After hearing this metallic noise, I froze. I could not move. I was too scared. I stood there for what seemed like hours, though it was probably 3 minutes or so. I then saw this huge creature walking towards me. This was no animal. It felt demonic. It stood at least 9 feet tall, if not more, and had glowing eyes. However, this wasn't eyeshine, as the darkness was caused by the sun setting behind the mountains. And it had this dark, thick fur, maybe a dark brown color. At some point I could move. It was still there, but it was just standing there, slightly hunched over. It was not a human, as it did not have the same proportions. Once I could move, I invoked Jesus' name, and it left. This thing was not an animal, it was a demon. I got back to camp and had dinner. Even though I was only away for 30 minutes, it felt like hours. I didn't tell anyone about this, as I thought they would think I was lying. The next 2 days nothing happened, but on the 4th day, when we woke up, all of our food was out and the cooler was open. There were large footprints, like 3 times the size of my feet, and I'm a size 16. This was no man, it was that same thing I saw on the trail. Nothing really else happened on that trip, but ever since I saw that thing, I've fallen into a deep depression. I tried to kill myself in early 2023. I'm okay now, just deeply terrified of those damn eyes. It seemed as though the creature would tear me apart if it managed to get its hands on me. I haven't gone camping since, though I've planned a trip with my great uncles this year. Since my grandpa's death, I feel obligated to go camping. They have been quite depressed. They were his younger brothers. He died in May if you're wondering. And yes, I'm still a Mormon, as I firmly believe our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, saved me that day. Anyway, have a great day. Cabin creature. This happened when I was just 12 years old, and it might take some backstory to make sense. So, at the time, I was a young girl about to start high school. Now I had some anxiety from the stress of changing schools and some family trouble, which didn't make things any easier for me. So, my mother is from Nova Scotia, and my father is from Europe. We were staying in a cabin in Nova Scotia. I won't say exactly where, but it was a place where we stayed almost every summer, so I was used to sleeping there. This waterside cabin borders a forest and another property. This happened one day in August, but I can't seem to remember the exact date. At the time my father was away for the night to visit a friend, so it was just me, my twin sister, who we'll just call Annabelle, my little brother, who we'll call Thomas, and my mother, Amanda, of course, not their real names. So, I was listening to something on my iPad, I don't remember what, and looking out the window at the forest. For the longest time, it was just forest, nothing for me to be alarmed about. But after an hour or so, I saw something in the woods. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of car headlights on the leaves, but when I kept looking at them, I realized that they were eyes, two large, gray, oval-shaped eyes. I didn't know what to do at first. I was paralyzed. I slowly walked away from the window, and the eyes shifted their gaze as whatever it was disappeared into the woods. I was shaken but decided not to tell anyone and tried to rationalize it as just being reflection, as I had thought before. I didn't see anything else for the rest of the night, but the next morning is when I really got a scare. I was sleeping in a room with my brother and my mother, while my sister slept down the hall. It was very hot, so I was having trouble sleeping. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, I had a dream. It was one of those dreams where you are just running, but you don't really know why, except this time I did know what I was running from. I didn't even need to look back to know what I was running from. It was the creature from the woods, and it was chasing me on all fours, from the sound of it. The dream only lasted a few seconds, but the worst part was when I woke up. My heart was beating faster than it ever had before, and I couldn't open my eyes. No matter how hard I tried, it felt as though something was holding them closed. All I could hear was my heart beating, but I could also hear this other sound. It sounded like heavy, raspy breath mixed with shrill screaming. After about 15 seconds, which felt like 15 minutes, I could open my eyes again, but I almost wish I hadn't. When I opened my eyes, I saw a tall, 7-foot-tall creature slowly going out the door of the room. The creature's skin was a light gray and looked not scaly but almost like that of a frog. Its mouth stretched across its face, and when it opened, it was much wider than any human could. It didn't look at me as it walked out of the room, and I just stared at it as it walked down the stairs and right through the locked front door. I didn't sleep much after that, and in the morning, I decided not to tell my family about it, since they did not see or hear the creature, and I did not want them to think I was insane. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but this was not the last time I saw that creature. Later that summer, we were back in our apartment. Now, our apartment looks over a street with 6 lanes, so there's almost always at least one car on that stretch of road, even late at night. So the night this took place, it was around 11 o'clock at night, and I was the only one in our living room. I was going to go to bed when I noticed something unusual outside my window. The street outside was completely empty, not even a parked car, but what I did see still makes me shudder whenever I think about it. The creature from the cabin was slowly walking down the road. At first it just walked down the road, then it stopped. Slowly, and to my horror, it turned its head up to make eye contact with me. Our apartment building has many levels, and it was at least 60 feet from our building. It met my eyes exactly. This lasted for about 5 seconds, then it looked away, and I ran to my bed as fast as I could. To this day, I still do not know what I saw those 2 nights. If anyone has any idea what I saw, please let me know. I haven't seen this creature since and hope I never see anything like that again. I don't know what was out there. So, this happened to me this year a few months ago. Around June. So, I was going to go to Deadwood, South Dakota, by driving there from North Dakota. I was going to go with my grandma and grandpa on my dad's side and my cousins and aunts on my dad's side as well. My mom didn't come with. Finally, the day arrived, and my mom and I drove to my grandparents' house. Everything went smoothly. So later that day, I was in the back of my grandpa's car, with my grandma in the passenger seat and me in the back. Not really important right now, but my phone had been broken for a long time before this trip, with lines on my screen and colorful lines on it. Sometimes the screen would shut off and not turn on, and that would scare me a little, but it would only turn off like that later into the trip. Let's get back to the story. So, I had a blanket in the back, a pillow, and another thing I can't remember. It was around an 8 to 10 hour drive, so I would sleep for at least 1/3 of the drive there, and I'd just skip to the part where we arrive. So we arrived, I slept around 5 hours on the drive, and I got out of the car, which was in the garage. Keep in mind this was a big, luxurious rental house you could stay in for maybe 1 to 2 weeks. I was only going to stay there for 1 week, though. Once I got out of the car, I was greeted by my older cousin. Let's just call her G. So I and G were really excited to see each other. We had only seen each other once before when I was really little. Anyways, a little later, and she was staying in a room with 2 beds. She had the bed closest to the window. I took the bed closest to the TV. After a while, it was nighttime, and we hung out in some other room and lay on the big bed in it. The people that last stayed there forgot to log out of Disney Plus, so we used that. She told me she was going to rewatch some JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I decided to watch it with her. Starting from the very start, that's the reason why I'm a big JoJo fan now. I've watched all the currently animated parts. Phantom Blood, Battle Tendency, Stardust Crusaders, Diamond is Unbreakable, Golden Wind, Stone Ocean. Anyways, that's not important. We watched up to the middle of Phantom Blood, and I fell asleep. All was normal still. So maybe a couple of days later, I, Grace, my other cousin, let's call her O, and some of my little cousins from Texas. G is also from Texas. There was a jacuzzi and a small sauna underneath the balcony. Keep in mind it was still around midday. So my cousins and I were crushing rocks, and I was sharpening a sharp stick on the concrete. They're kids, don't judge me, okay? And so I had thrown my stick somewhere, and I wandered away from my cousins. Keep in mind this rental house was maybe 100 feet away from the next several rental houses, and these were very close to the woods. Like, the actual woods. No sign of humanity 20 feet away from the balcony. I walked around the house, and suddenly it got very quiet. I didn't even hear my cousins. They were fine, I was just on the opposite side of the house. So, there I was, standing in between two rental houses, staring into the forest. I don't know what I felt at that moment. I felt like something was calling me to keep walking. It felt like something was out there in those woods. I took a step forward. It felt like it was just me and the agonizing silence and whatever was out there in those woods. I soon felt a very strong sense of dread and fear. I was frozen. It was the most surreal, tranquil, yet terrifying experience of my life. It felt like time was slowed. It felt like I and whatever was out there were the only things there. I'm not talking about something like a spirit or a person. I'm talking about a cryptid-type presence. It was like an animal, but it felt like whatever was out there was partly human. Safe to say I snapped out of it and slowly walked away from those woods. I didn't go back out that close to the woods the rest of my stay. Later that day, it was just me and G chilling in the jacuzzi. It was night. It was very dark. It was silent. Only the small sound of the buzzing of the jacuzzi. I stared out into the black void of the woods. It was pitch black. I think I was the only one who felt it, but that feeling of dread and fear slightly came back. I brushed it off, and the rest of the time we were out there, it was just us and the darkness. I didn't talk about both of the times I felt that presence. That's the end of my story about my trip to the outskirts of Deadwood, South Dakota. I haven't told anyone about this experience. Only you, listening to this, know the story. I haven't had an experience like that since then. P.S. If you think this is fake, it's not. Thank you for listening to this. I've been wanting to tell this story since it happened, but after 40 years, I'm at a loss for words. I grew up on a ranch on the border of Idaho and Utah. My family dates way back as cattlemen and horse breeders. We own 20,000 acres in Idaho that butt up to a spread in Utah, and then as you go east, the Utah ranch stops and heads south. We own the land next to them on the east side of Utah. That's a slightly larger piece of land, measuring approximately 47,000 acres. Anyway, our horse ranch was in Idaho, mostly contained north of the border. We had a Hughes 500C helicopter equivalent back then and used it a lot to gather our wilds or keep track of cattle. Anyway, I was tasked with basically covering both ranches as much as possible that day. So we took off and headed north real slow, getting back in the saddle and controls, and started our sweep. Below us on the way north, we caught a group of wilds, which we considered ours since they stayed on our property, but among them was a particularly marked Appaloosa pony with a design no one had ever seen. We spun down a little to do a 360 on it and then did the rest of sweeping the perimeter. That horse, when we saw it, was in the SW corner of the property. We flew north, zigzagging along the southern border. At the northeast point of land, I set it down to scope for some elk that were down in there. Elk love to mix with horses on open terrain, so you really have to look. Well, we're seeing some, but as I sweep the scope farther behind them, I swear to God that damn Appaloosa was grazing. I shout to my cowhand, and he comes over, and I show him, and he just whistles and says, "No way. That horse is at least miles from there and over a steep ridge." So we fired up and flew over there, and we both just stared as I did a high roundabout. It was the same horse, but no way. So we finish Idaho and hop over to Utah and start doing north by souths, looking over everything, and finally get into the mountains that end our property. So on the final and furthest leg from the hangar on our land, I did a low, slow pass over the rocks and boulders to see if we could catch a wolf or some coyotes, and as I bank over the ridge, I'm telling you, as would to God, the damn horse is up in some trails on that mountain. The Appaloosa. And believe me, after that much time, you know every animal, and this one is so specially marked, and now he's in a place he couldn't possibly be, but yet we know this is not a joke. That horse is the same one 25 miles away. Needless to say, when we got back, we buzzed that first pasture, and he was head down eating grass. I had a stomach sickness come over me, and the ranch hand sitting next to me had his head down and was making the sign of the cross over and praying to Jesus in Spanish. Needless to say, We couldn't say anything to the bosses or my dad, or we'd be laughed off the property. Years later, I saw an article about the ranch we didn't own across the border in Utah. And the Indians named it. They called it Skinwalker Ranch and would go there before it was owned. And I started looking into it, and it is forever burned in my mind as to whether any of the things that happened there had something to do with my horse. I really cannot allow my thoughts on this to wander. I convince myself that it was just a figment of our imagination, but I'm unsure. I haven't been there for 20 years, but sometimes I feel like going to that ranch and seeing what it looks like. The strange man in the woods. I live in a small town in South Africa. Near my town there is a large patch of woods, and since the outbreak, I haven't been in the woods for a long time. Until that day. So my friend called me to ask if I wanted to join him and a few other mates to play a game of paintball in the woods, and obviously I was keen. I got my paintball gear and gun and headed off to my mate's place. There were 6 of us: Chase, Liam, Matt, Joey, Steven, and obviously me. We headed off to the woods but made a few stops to fill up on petrol and get some gas for the paintball guns. When we finally got to the woods, we parked the cars, got in our gear, and ventured out into the forest to find the perfect spot to paintball. Eventually we got deep enough into an area with sufficient cover and space to play a good game of capture the flag. We played a couple of games, and because it's winter, it got dark quickly. However, we prepared ahead of time, brought our flashlights, and decided to play a couple of night games, which are particularly challenging in the forest we were in. During one match, Joey and I decided to sit out because we were both tired and just needed a quick breather, and the others continued to play from a significantly good distance away from us. While we were chilling, I was rolling up a joint. Yes, I'm a pothead, and Joey went to go take a piss a couple of meters away from me. While I was busy rolling, I had the flashlight pointing towards myself since there was no other light to allow me to see what I was doing, and around me, it was completely dark. I couldn't even see 2 meters ahead of myself because of how pitch black it was. Suddenly I heard footsteps coming my way, but I thought it was Joey, and I soon realized I couldn't see any light from his flashlight, so now I was more vigilant but still relaxed, thinking he was trying to play a prank on me or something. But the footsteps stopped a few meters away from me, so I lifted up my flashlight and pointed it in the direction where I heard the footsteps and scanned the area, but I just saw bushes and trees, and I just thought it might be Joey hiding in the bushes or behind a tree waiting to give me a jump scare, and then I heard footsteps coming in the opposite direction, and when I looked, I could see it was Joey because he was holding his flashlight. That's when I stopped what I was doing and picked up my flashlight and paintball gun, and when Joey reached me, I whispered, "Bro, I think there is someone over there," and Joey obviously didn't believe me and just said to me to stop being a baby, but he soon regretted saying that because I decided to do one last scan of where I heard the footsteps, and to my horror, I saw someone peeking and staring right at me from behind a tree probably 10 or 11 meters away from us. I just shouted, "What the actual duck?" When Joey heard me utter these words, he glanced at me, then at the man, who immediately jumped up and picked up his paintball gun. We stared at each other for at least 2 minutes, but it felt like forever until he stepped out from behind the tree. He was a large man, at least 6 feet, and was honestly filthy, like he hadn't bathed in years. He was wearing baggy, ripped up jeans and just an old, dirty, zipped up bomber jacket, plus we could see that he was on something or he was just batshit crazy, and he was holding something behind his back. He finally asked, "What are you guys doing out here when it's so dark?" We were too shocked to respond. Joey stuttered with fear in his voice, "We were just leaving," but the man nodded his head in disagreement and said, "No, you're not, your friends are still playing the game." I felt a shiver down my spine. "How about we play a game of our own while we wait for your friends?" And that is when he finally showed us what he was hiding behind his back, and it was a large machete. That's when I knew we had to get out of there. So I aimed my paintball gun, and in the toughest way I could muster up, I told him, "Leave now or I will shoot," even though I only had about 6 or 7 paintballs loaded. Joey did the exact same by aiming his gun at the man, even though he had no paintballs in his gun, but he didn't even flinch but did something that honestly made my skin crawl. He just smiled and said, "The game starts now," and suddenly he just rushed at us, so I told Joey to run while I fired my last bullets at him, and luckily I shot him in his head, which caused him to fall, so that was our chance to book it and link up with our other friends. As soon as we started running, we heard his footsteps again, and he was actually gaining on us again. We could hardly see, but we couldn't slow down because we knew what would happen, so we kept sprinting until we heard other paintball guns firing, indicating we were close. Joey started shouting to get everyone's attention, and all of a sudden, I heard a huge thud. Joey tripped and twisted his ankle. I turned around to help him up, and when I did, I could see the man running full sprint towards us. In that moment I thought it was going to be the end for us, but our friends heard our screams for help and rushed to us, and when they saw the man, they just started firing at him, and he knew he wasn't going to be able to take us all on, and he decided to turn around and disappear into the forest. We helped Joey up, rushed to get our stuff, and ran to the cars. When we arrived at my friend's place, we assisted Joey in treating his ankle. I then proceeded to tell my friends about everything that had happened, which left them feeling creeped out. It's safe to say that the next time I'm in those woods, I will be more vigilant. A ghost in the hills of Rincon. My family and I live in Long Island, New York. I'm 20 years old, and I live with my mom, dad, and little sister. Both sides of my family come from Puerto Rico, and for my entire life we've taken trips there every 2 or 3 years or so. It has probably been about 5 years since we were last there. This happened many years ago, during the most recent trip to PR that we've taken. My mom's coworker owned a condo in a town in PR called Rincon, which is on the northwestern coast of the island and is a haven for surfers. This one particular night, we were driving back to the condo after a long day of adventuring and sightseeing. We had rented a Jeep for the trip, so I was sitting in the passenger seat, my dad was driving, and my mom and sister were sitting in the back seat. This particular night, it was stormy and humid. We knew that a thunderstorm was coming, the kind that is common in PR, where a storm will arrive out of nowhere and be as strong as a hurricane, and then dissipate not 10 minutes later like nothing ever happened. Anyways, I don't think it was raining yet, but there was thunder and lightning by the time we had arrived back in Rincon. Rincon is very hilly because it basically sits at the top of a hill at the bottom of which is the beach. All of the roads twist this way and that, and some of these turns are pretty sharp and very steep. As my dad started up a steep incline, getting closer and closer to the condo complex where we were staying, we both saw, at the same exact time, a smoky gray figure, in the shape of a person that was running, dart across the beam of the headlights from the left side of the road to the right side. Our sight of this figure couldn't have lasted for more than 2 seconds. I have always wondered if it could have been a trick of the light, with the headlights mixing with the mist and vapor from the rainforest outside. But the proof I have that it couldn't have been a trick of the eyes is this: my mom later told my dad and me that she saw us both widen our eyes and look at each other at the exact same time and ask each other, "Did you see that?" If it had been a trick of the headlights, I don't see how my dad and I could have both seen what we thought was a human figure, and both seen it at the same exact time, and both had the same exact reaction. This figure was dark gray and it basically consisted of a cloud of smoke in the shape of a human being. It ran around 10 feet in front of the Jeep from the left to the right side of the road into the right-hand trees. The second that my dad and I both looked at each other, either he or my mom urged us to keep silent, not wanting to scare my little sister. But I'll never forget how absolutely sure my mom was that my dad's and my simultaneous reaction to seeing this thing could not have been a coincidence. One other thing I remember is that once we got back to the condo and were able to discuss what we'd seen out of earshot of my sister, my dad kept the conversation to a minimum because we all believe that speaking about a spirit, giving it our attention, whether it's good or evil, draws it to us, and that's not something we wanted to do. My dad suggested the theory I was thinking from the start: could it have been the spirit of a local runner/jogger? Perhaps a car had struck the individual while they were jogging? It could easily have been just a quick trick of the lights, but I feel as though my dad's and my absolutely identical observations stand against that. I feel the need to pray for the soul of this person, that they may find eternal rest. I share this with you all, not to scare you or excite you, primarily, but to express what I feel is the only time in my life where I genuinely saw a ghost. Something followed me through the cornfield that's behind my apartment. I've lived in this small apartment with my family in an incredibly quiet neighborhood for as long as I can remember. Our place was so serene there were hardly any cars around, even though we lived just 5 minutes away from a primary school. Behind our apartment, there's this long street surrounded by trees, like a long forest. What scares me the most, though, is the massive cornfield right outside my bedroom window. One evening, my mom went to a neighbor's party, leaving me home alone as usual. With the sky turning gray after sunset, I took my little dog out. Despite the forest road creeping me out, I'd often stroll there with my dog. She decided to do her thing right in front of the cornfield, and as I waited and looked into the nothingness, I noticed the corn in the middle of the field shaking. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw it moving toward me. Panic kicked in, I grabbed my dog, and we sprinted home. Whatever it was, it kept up with us, causing the cornfield to rustle wildly. I made it home, exhausted. Luckily, I haven't lived there for a year now, but that eerie incident still haunts me. I understand some may say it could be an animal, but it moved really, really fast through the field, almost even supernatural. One of mine was just recently. While camping and hunting just a couple of weeks ago at Uwari NF, I was at the campfire just staring into the flames like one does at night with nothing going on. It was a night, actually warm for December with a nice 5 to 10 miles per hour breeze. I stood up to get more wood from a pile I made 10 away, and as soon as I stood, I got a weird feeling and stared into the darkness to my right. All of a sudden it sounded like a football team crashing through the woods towards me and above me. A good 5 seconds of it, I'd guess. I even took a few steps back and yelled out, "Who?" Then a big thud as the top half of a tree crashed right at my feet. As I was there thinking and a little shaking, man, it's so dark out. I had no clue that was coming down. About 30 to 50 yards deeper in the woods in the same direction, still to my right, the same thing again. A series of cracks and pops were heard, followed by a loud thud. Another tree came down. I just had that freaked out feeling like when you're a kid and you don't want to stick your feet off the end of the bed because something's going to grab them lol. I threw a bunch of wood on the fire to light the whole camp, which gave me comfort, and I sat and lit a cigarette. I wasn't halfway through with it, and across the road now to my left, about 50 yards, a bunch of popping and cracking with another big thud. Another one came down, I guess. After that one I was like, screw this, I'm going in the tent to read my book so I can go to sleep, as reading makes me tired. I would have been fine, I believe, if it weren't for all these videos I watch and missing 411 and listening to stuff like these putting ideas in my head. Got me thinking about Bigfoot or who knows what. All my other scary scenarios have been logical and natural, like cougars, getting lost, lightning, etc. This incident has really been my only incident where my mind ran away with me, thinking something supernatural or something. There was no wind, so I don't know why all these trees were falling. What was it? I used to be really close with one of my best friends until I and my friend group fell out. I'm going to call her Emma. I and Emma used to hang out a lot outside of the friendship group together. Her mom would drop her off at my house and pick her up, etc., and all that. When we hung out, it was usually dark, so I'd let my parents know where I'm going and what I'm doing just to be safe and message every so often to let them know I'm alright. One night Emma had come round, and we had planned to go to a woods near my house. This woods had a cool park with a big slide, and it was like this high upward climbing thing right near the entrance, and the plan was to pretty much go there and mess about for a bit. This was the first time we went in the woods after dark. We got there and had our phone torches on. We were blasting music from my phone and just messing about on the high up slide bit and bridges that went along the whole place area. It was getting really dark, so I suggested that we go back to mine or just somewhere else in general, as I have a fear of the dark and something felt off. As I started climbing down the ladder to get to the floor, I heard sounds near the bushes, like a tap 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 sound, as if it was raining. But there was no rain. I looked at my other friend, and she must have heard it too because I mentioned it after we left, and she said it was weird. Emma came round again, and we planned as a joke to go walking in the woods at night as a chill thing and to maybe duck around with dog walkers or people in the woods as a joke, all that. We got in and went to the opposite side from where the park was, like way across the woods. The park was very far. On the other side of the woods, we walked down a big path with a proper flashlight in hand as we messed about talking about school and problems in the friend group I was in at the time. Around 15 to 20 minutes down the path, we went on a different one to a clearing that was surrounded by the woods. As I flashed the light into the tree line, I saw two glowing things. Dots maybe. I shook it off as those dog collars that lit up and assumed it was just two dogs with their owner who had gone further up the path than their owner. We walked to the whole other side of the forest in around 15 minutes, which is pretty quick for how far we were from the park side of the forest where the main exit was, and we were walking on the side where the park was. I and Emma had this bench next to the field, which was also surrounded by the forest, and we went there often. Emma sat down, and I flashed the torch around us. Until I stopped. From behind a tree, I saw a small black figure as if I was peering from behind the tree at me and Emma. I whispered to Emma, "We need to get on the other side of this field now." And as she got up, I looked at her and jogged across the field into the tree line, and Emma followed along. I explained what I saw, and she started freaking out a little, so I suggested we leave and go to mine immediately. We began walking the path we were on, which would lead us to some exit, as I had been here many times before. I kept flashing the light behind us and around us as we walked, making sure we were alone. How I wish I hadn't. Around the 5th time I shined the light behind us, I stopped. Emma stopped and said my name, but I just stared at what I was seeing. Two pairs of glowing eyes flashing again in the light, except I couldn't see a body, like as if it wasn't an animal, it was just some black thing with eyes. I even zoomed the flashlight in on the eyes, but nothing really was lighting except the pair of eyes. Now for anyone who may be like, oh, it's just an animal, a fox, or a dog. I live in Britain, and foxes here usually run from humans or even noises. And there were no other people around for it to be some dog since I called out several times to make sure. Hello? Anyone there? Is this your dog? And many other things that anyone would have responded to. But silence. Emma started walking off terrified, but I couldn't turn away from it. Soon enough I did, and we ran across the field again and quickly left the woods. As we left and began walking down the roads to my house, I turned to her, and that's when I realized. The glowing things we saw earlier had followed us to the whole other side of the forest. I haven't been to the woods since, and it freaks me out to even think about going. If anyone knows what it could be, please tell me. The girl on the dead log. When I was in my early 20s, I used to jog through a massive cemetery called Hillside, just outside Philly, when I came home from Temple U to visit my mom. I loved jogging through there because it was so quiet and peaceful aside from the sounds of nature. One very late afternoon, dusk, I was jogging through the main part of the cemetery and started to move along a small service road deeper in the cemetery about 0.5 miles long that connects to another cemetery in an adjacent town called Ardsley Cemetery. There are roughly 100 yards of uncut grassland/weeds on both sides of the little road that lead to dense forests, with one side, on the left, leading to fenced-off railroad tracks surrounded by trees that ran through the area. As I approached midpoint, I noticed a teenish girl sitting on a massive dead log, stripped of bark, to the left that must have been dragged out somehow close to the road after falling in the woods. She was distinctly wearing 70s clothes, a retro fad in the early 90s? With massive bell bottoms, a scruffy white blouse, greasy sandy blonde hair parted in the middle, and leather sandals. She did not face me as I approached and just kept her head facing the dark woods across the other side of the road. But I know she must have heard me hitting the pavement as I approached. So now we are the only people on this old, little service road with no one in front or behind as I passed between the two cemeteries. As I approached her and crossed her line of sight, she quickly shifted her eyes toward me, as I said hi, and I was shocked/stunned/blasted by the weirdness of her face with larger than normal eyes, a tiny nose, a thin small mouth, and the whiteness of her skin. And her eyes. They were white and blue, like a Siberian husky, with massive dark rings around the irises. She said nothing back and just stared at me, expressionless, as I stumbled past. I say stumbled because I immediately felt this force hit my perception when we locked eyes, which made everything super detailed, like when you're tripping, and surreal. I could no longer hear the sound of my own shoes hitting the pavement anymore for those endless seconds, deafness. No sounds, not even the crickets. And time seemed to slow down as if I was jogging in slow motion. Disoriented as I was, I continued along the road, past her, toward the other cemetery for about 5 to 7 seconds, and my curiosity got the better of me, so I turned around to jog back, but she was completely gone. Nothing there but this huge dead log. I checked all around it. Nothing. Now I know the area quite well, and there is absolutely no way she could have left my new line of sight unless she sprinted the 100 yards to the woods in less than 7 seconds. Impossible, especially in her clothes. I scanned the tree lines, and nothing, just darkening woods as the sun fell below the tree line, but a feeling I was being watched. Again, no sound of crickets. Hairs on my neck and arms standing on end despite heavy sweating from the run. I believe I completed a 7-minute mile from that location to my home before the sun completely set. It gives me the chills every time I think about that face and those piercing eyes. Suffice to say, I never felt the urge to jog through there again. Grandpa shot something. My grandfather was a badass. He was born in Alberta during the early 30s and raised his 3 brothers on a reservation from the time he was 9, when his parents left for BC with their only daughter, promised to return, and none of the boys ever saw them again. To make ends meet, he learned carpentry and worked as a laborer and bare-knuckle boxed against older men for extra cash. He learned how to track and hunt and always came home with something to eat when work was scarce. When he was 14, he put the second oldest brother in charge of the household, left the res in search of his parents and a better life, and never went back. That was the last time he saw any of his family members. He spent several months riding the rails, befriending some transients while using his fighting skills to defend himself against others. He eventually made his way to Vancouver, the last known whereabouts of his parents and sister, and started working in a pulp mill. At 17, he met my grandmother, and the two eventually married, leading to him giving up his search for his family. They bought some land, and he spent his free time building several houses, which still stand today. One of those sat on the land he bought with my grandmother, which included acres of wooded area. On this land, My grandparents kept horses and dogs and small farm animals for eggs and meat. My aunt was born in the early 50s, and then my mother came along right before the end of the decade. As far as I've heard, nothing bad or strange really happened until my mom found an old Ouija board and played with it by herself, but I don't know if that relates to this story. My mother was around 8 when she was riding her horse through the wooded part of their acreage when the horse stopped dead in its tracks. My mom tried to spur it on, but it was frozen in fear, and all of a sudden she smelled something like rotting garbage and meat. She pulled back on the reins, and the horse instantly turned and took off back towards the house, almost knocking her off its back several times along the way. Afterwards, that horse was never the same. It would try to kick her, and if she got on it, it would fall backwards, trying to crush her beneath it. Once, it started acting like its old self again, letting her climb onto it, but once she did, it ran towards the road and stopped abruptly, bucking her forward into the path of an oncoming car. My grandpa saw it happen and put a shotgun to its head, and the horse just kept breathing heavily and staring straight ahead. My mother barely missed being run over by a car that saw the horse coming and managed to swerve out of the way, and my grandmother begged my grandfather not to shoot the horse. He finally decided to give it away when he saw my mother wasn't badly injured. That same horse fell on the next person to ride it, breaking her collarbone, and the father did what my grandpa said he should have done the first time. After that, animals started going missing, and one of the hunting dogs was injured by something during an attack at night. My grandpa set out some traps, stayed in the hayloft above the barn with a shotgun and rifle beside him, and slept out there for several nights. He figured it was foxes, or maybe coyotes or wolves, or even a desperate bear, which is what he attributed the smell in the woods to and the horse's reason for losing its mind. But nothing came the entire time he slept out there, and eventually he figured it had moved on to easier prey or died. The day after he stopped sleeping in the barn, my mom was out near the tree line playing with the injured dog as it was healing. Out of nowhere, the dog started sniffing the air, then positioned itself between my mom and the trees, growling and barking. My grandpa heard the noise and came out, stopped in his tracks, and called back to my grandmother to bring his rifle, then whistled for the dogs. My grandma came out, handed him his gun, then asked what was going on. As the dogs all started to react like the first one, my grandfather pointed to one of the treetops, which looked longer and thicker than those around it, but it was very slightly moving. It was at least 6 feet tall, he told me later on when he'd retell the story, but probably a good bit taller. He took aim and fired just as he saw a pair of wings start to open up. Whatever was up there was watching them, but he beat it to the punch. It was a kill shot, directly in the chest with a high-powered rifle, and he instantly started running forward with all of the dogs following him as the thing plummeted to the ground, the breaking of tree branches wholly unmistakable. When he reached the impact point, he raised his rifle again and commanded the dogs forward to flush it out, but they all just stood in the spot and kept spinning around, trying to catch a scent that seemingly disappeared. A pile of broken branches lay in an obvious landing spot, but beyond that there was no proof that anything had happened. There was no sign of a body, no blood, and no trail left behind. It had either disappeared or gone straight back up the way it came. He searched those woods for several days but never found a sign of what that thing was, and they didn't see it or experience issues with the animals after that. Decades later, when he was dying, he kept talking about how he saw something. In his delirium, he referred to it as an alien but said it was coming back for him. I've never seen that man scared of anything in my life, but there was actual panic and fear in his voice. A few nights before he died, he had already been too weak to stand on his own for several days, and my grandmother awoke to the sound of a gunshot. Fearing the worst, she rushed outside and witnessed my grandfather lowering his rifle while gazing at a distant object. She took the gun away and helped him back inside, and that was it. I don't know if whatever it was actually did come back for him, or if it was a hallucination of an old memory, but I'd like to think he went out with a final duck you to the thing that tried to torment his family all those years ago. This happened during the summer of '82, right after we graduated from high school. 2 friends and I decided to take a few days and go backpacking in the Ouachita National Forest, in Far S.E., Oklahoma. Specifically, we were on Winding Stair Mountain. There is a national hiking trail that follows along the crest of that mountain. It's really more like a ridge than a mountain. And although it's called a mountain, we're not talking elevations like in the Rockies, for example. Winding Stair Mountain probably averages between 2,000 and 2,500 feet. But for Oklahoma, that's pretty good. On the second night of our trip, we stopped to camp along a stretch of the trail that overlooks a valley. At the bottom of the valley, a couple of miles away, you can see a lake called Lake Bohannon. And although we couldn't see it from our vantage point, next to that lake is a Boy Scout camp called Camp Tom Hale. One of my traveling friends was a Boy Scout and attended that camp. And, as you might expect, they told stories to each other about a Bigfoot-like monster that roamed the forests out there. Anyway, we set up camp right on the hiking trail. In fact, we built our campfire ring on the trail itself. The reason is because the trail was broad, hard-packed bare earth. So we felt this was safest. Besides, we hadn't seen any other hikers during our time out there, and we promised ourselves that next morning we would completely douse the coals and redisperse the fire ring rocks. That way, there would be hardly any trace left that we had ever built a campfire there. For sleeping, I had brought a mesh hammock, which I strung up between two trees. I set it up parallel to the trail, and I had the campfire to my immediate left. My two friends slept on the ground, spreading out a tarp and sleeping bags directly opposite the campfire from me, on the other side of the trail. To my right, I had a nice view of that valley and the lake, with the mountain sloping down away from me. As it got dark, we cooked dinner over the fire, BS'd around for a while, and then finally turned in for the night. It was a beautiful, clear summer night, with a soft breeze coming up from the valley. We continued to talk for a while after everyone had gone to bed, but I eventually drifted off to sleep in my hammock. At some point during the night, I woke up. I'm sure I had a watch on me, but I don't remember now the exact time. However, it must have been well after midnight because I saw that our campfire had burned itself down to just a bed of coals. I lay there for a minute, looking up at the stars through the pine tree tops, wondering what had caused me to wake up. And then I heard it. It sounded like something walking through the underbrush, up the slope to my right, and towards our camp. It would walk a little, then stop. Then walk some more and stop again. But it was definitely getting closer. Now, I am no expert woodsman, but to me, it didn't sound like a 4-footed animal, which would make a sound more like a continuous rustle through the leaves and underbrush. This sounded like individual footsteps, like someone walking on 2 feet. There was really nothing I could think of to do, except just keep quiet and wait to see what would happen. The only weapons I had with me were a hatchet for chopping firewood and a hunting knife. Fortunately, I had both of these with me in the hammock, sheathed, of course, because I am paranoid like that. So I quietly unsheathed them, clutched one in each hand, waited, and listened. Whatever it was finally got to what sounded like a few dozen feet from our camp and then stopped again. Next, instead of coming even closer, it started to circle our camp. And of course, it circled our camp in a direction that had it going behind me as I lay in my hammock, rather than in the direction that my feet were pointing. Which meant that if it approached closer, I could not see what it was without sitting up or even rolling completely out of my hammock. Eventually, it circled around until it was directly behind my head as I lay in the hammock, but it still kept its distance. Then things got quiet again. You will remember that I mentioned that the hiking trail was broad, hard-packed earth. I thought to myself, whatever it is, it could now just walk down the trail toward our camp and not make a sound. I wouldn't even know it was there until it was literally standing right next to me, where I could look up from my hammock and see it. If you've ever heard the saying about your blood running cold, it's true. I actually felt like I had ice water running through my veins at that point. However, a moment later, the sounds of it walking through the leaves and underbrush started again. It had not walked down the trail towards our camp after all, but had instead crossed the trail and was now behind me and to my upper left. It continued to circle our camp until it got to a point roughly directly to my left, a few dozen feet beyond the spot where my friends were sleeping. It stopped there for a few minutes, and then it began retracing its path. It crossed the trail again, directly up behind me as I lay in the hammock, and walked back into the underbrush to my upper right. It circled back around until it was to my direct right again, approximately to where it had started. And then it went back down the mountainside until I could no longer hear it in the distance as it moved through the underbrush. I continued to lay there in my hammock, wondering WTH it could have been. Then suddenly, one of my friends whispered from out of the darkness on the other side of the fire ring, "Hey Brett, are you awake?" I replied that I was, and he asked, "Did you hear that too?" This was the friend who had been a Boy Scout. I said yes. It woke me up, and I lay here listening to it this whole time. Then we both got up and immediately built our campfire back up. We had saved back some firewood to use for cooking breakfast the following morning, but we threw it all on the fire now instead. We sat there for a while, talking and comparing notes about what we'd heard. But eventually, we both calmed down again and finally went back to bed, with no further incidents for the rest of the night. The third guy had slept through the whole thing. He didn't even wake up when we got up and rebuilt our campfire. The next day, we headed back down the trail toward the trailhead, spent a third night on the mountain with nothing unusual happening, and went home the following day. We actually went backpacking out there again a few times over the next couple of years when we were all home from college or whatever. But nothing like that ever happened again, and now it's been decades since the last time I was down in that part of the state. This happened in January of 2018, when I was in 6th grade and 11 years old. I was a pretty average kid, I got A's and B's, and I had a few friends, one of whom was my best friend. We'll call him Colin. Colin lived about half an hour away from me, so I didn't go to his house that often. When I did go to his house, we would always play in his woods. He had a good 3 acres of just forest and trees and creeks. There was also a good-sized pond that we would go fishing in during the summer months. However, there was an abandoned house by the end of the property. It was a normal house, 2 floors. It had been abandoned in the 1960s, according to Colin. Since the 1970s, teenagers had been partying in it and had trashed it. Colin's eldest sister, Anna, who was 26 at the time of writing, used to party in it as well, but she stopped sometime before Colin was born for reasons she would not say. The one time we told her we were going, she freaked out. She advised us to avoid that location at all costs and to never venture inside, particularly in the basement. We just thought she was talking about drugs or alcohol, but we were wrong. So wrong. I had taken the bus over to Colin's house on Friday, and I stayed the night, with plans to explore the abandoned house the next morning. When we woke up, we put our orange vests and paintball masks on so that we would be easy to find. We took a gator, that kind of pickup truck ATV you see at farms, to the end of the trail, where I noticed it eventually began to get paved. "Hey, Colin?" I asked. "Yeah? Did you ever pave this trail?" "Nah, man." "Huh. Stop the gator," I yelled. Colin slammed on the brakes and asked what the hell was wrong. I was staring off into one part of the snow-covered forest. I saw a set of stairs. Like stairs from your house. Just taken from a random house and then dropped in the woods. I thought they were really cool, but Colin made it very clear that we should just keep going. He might have just been tired, but I think that there's another reason. I've researched the stairs, and some things have come up, but if you know anything, please let me know. We kept going, and I started to notice how the further we went on this trail, the more dead the trees were. Even though it was winter and snowing out, the trees were visibly dead. I pointed this out to Colin, but he again just shrugged it off. We got to the house, and you can see the view from the gator in the photo below. The trees have cleared out to reveal the small yard. We got off the gator, and Colin grabbed his rifle from its bed. We went to the door, and Colin shot off the knob. "Ladies first, ha, ha, ha," he said. It was nice of him to try to lighten the mood, but I was starting to regret coming here. We heard a loud crash in the basement. Both of us literally started pissing ourselves. "What the hell was that?" I said. I felt like I was going to throw up. We went inside. Colin aimed his gun around. We went upstairs first. We didn't find much, as everything was trashed from the parties that used to go on here. Something I forgot to mention was that the parties suddenly stopped one night in 2002 for an unknown reason. There were so many mysteries in this house, and I was so glad to finally be here. But I was also trying to figure out what possibly could have made that noise. We finished upstairs and went to the main floor. Once again we found nothing. But as we made our way to the back door, we discovered pieces of the deer, including its legs and guts. We found a trail of blood and followed it to the basement door. It led to darkness. "Maybe we shouldn't go down," I said, but was cut off by Colin with, "TJ, shut the hell up right now." Colin's eyes were wider than I knew possible. I thought the skin would tear at his temples. Colin pointed towards the basement, and I saw it, 2 yellow eyes the size of grapefruits. "AHH. I screamed. I mimicked my scream in a distortion that scared the absolute hell out of me. It came closer, and the light of my phone flashlight illuminated its face. It was not human. Its eyes took up most of its face. It smiled this horrible smile, revealing yellow teeth. It slowly cocked its head, to the point where it had passed 180 degrees. "Colin, shoot it," I said. The thing imitated it once again in that distorted voice. "Let's just get out of here," Colin told me. We dashed to the door, which was closed and locked. I fiddled with the lock until the creature took what Colin would later call an impossibly long step towards us, and it leaned over me. I didn't notice until I felt a drop of drool drip on my neck. My heart sank. "TJ. Move." Colin blew the lock off with the gun again. The knob had been put back on. We ran to the gator, and Colin floored it. We almost crashed when we heard a loud, inhuman shriek come from the house. We got back to Colin's. We called the police, and since I knew they wouldn't come if we said there was a monster in that house, we said that there was a dangerous person in it. Colin's parents were not home, and his siblings were off doing things, so it was just me and him. The cops came after what seemed like hours of looking out the window to see if it was there. We told them that it was in the abandoned house in the basement. After about 45 minutes to an hour, The officers came back, radioing for a coroner and a forensics unit. The cops asked us a few questions, and then they told us what they found in the basement. The object was long gone, but they discovered bones and remains, some of which were human. They found bodies that, later, after DNA testing, were found to belong to missing persons from months and even years ago. The saddest part was when they told us about the remains of small bones that they thought to be animal bones, but after more DNA testing, they were found to be human and belonging to someone who was less than a year old. The story isn't over yet. What made me want to write this story was something that happened to me a few weeks ago. Colin texts me at about 7 p.m. sounding panicked. I ask him what is wrong. He sends me the following, copied and pasted from the actual text. Anna told me what happened in that house. In '98 she was at a party at the house, and everyone was drunk except for her. A guy gets taken into the basement, and he doesn't come out. His parents file a missing persons report, and no one knows where he is until New Year's Eve 1999, when Anna arrives at the New Year's party to find cops examining the body of the guy, all bloody and screwed up. Anna stopped going to the parties from then on. She got so mad at me, bro. This experience deeply unnerved me, and I still struggle to sleep on some nights. I am now 12 years old at the time of this writing, going into 7th grade. I still think about what would have happened if we had gone to the basement. What if we had been one of the bodies in the basement? I hope no one ever has to feel that kind of fear that I and Colin did. I know that it's still out there. I'm going to a Boy Scout camp next week, and I think this will be a good story to tell at the campfire, but I hope it doesn't come true at the camp. Backwoods Slender Man. This happened around October 7th when I went outside to take out the trash at 10 p.m. because my mom made me. I have had experiences with strange dark things in the past and similar situations like this, but this is the first time I have fully seen my monster. I was taking out the trash. The garbage cans are in our gravel driveway. Due to the late hour and my intention to go to bed immediately after, I removed my glasses and placed them in my room, which resulted in my vision being limited. Basically anything out of arm's reach I couldn't see in physical form, and I turned to face my neighbor's yard when I saw it. It was tall, white as snow, and couldn't want to get up on my neighbor's back porch, which is a good 3 to 4 feet off the ground in some places, 5. This thing was in one of the 5-foot places. I saw its head facing my neighbor's house, then I turned away, then I looked back at it. Its head was hunched over, and I could tell its eyes were on me. I turned and started to walk up the driveway through our front yard into our house. I closed and locked the doors and then went to sleep. The next day nothing happened, but the day after I say it again. The only difference is that it was in my great-aunt's side yard. You could see it because we lived directly across from her. I saw the thing on all fours creeping towards the road when it noticed I was watching. It did something like a smile and then quickly crept back into my aunt's backyard. I don't know what saved me that night, whether it was my glasses or because my front door was clearly open or because I had my mom's car keys. The only thing I know is that this thing is smart and calculated, and it will come back. I don't know if it's because of me or someone else. I've never been a very outdoorsy person, so while I was excited about the new location and the prospect of being around my favorite animals so much, I was never too into the fact that we were in the middle of forests and somewhat excluded, especially since I was in my early teens during the time we lived there and thus was dependent on getting a ride if I wanted to go out to the city. For further information, I lived in southern Finland, where there really isn't anything to fear in the forest, per se, but I've always been imaginative enough to make up for it. Now getting into what I was constantly paranoid about over the 5-ish years I lived there, which was being alone outside. I did not mind being around the horses or riding them in the forest, but every time I had to walk around on my own, I often felt very unsettled. I always attributed this to my weak mentality, and it was true for the most part. It was fine during the daytime, but I would run from place to place in the dark with my heartbeat in my throat. It wasn't a concrete fear of anything specific like the dark, but just a sensation of primal fear. The worst part was waiting for the school bus in the morning because of how dark it is out here for most of the year, so I would have to stand by myself at the edge of our property on winter mornings and just pray that nothing was out there. It didn't help that the house wasn't even a safe place for me. It was large, and for most of the time it was just me and my mom, but she was out a lot going to work and tending to the animals, and I spent a lot of time alone in the house. There were parts of the house I avoided going to, and there was a generally strange vibe about the place. I don't know about the history of the house, but I do believe the previous owners hurt their dogs. There were teeth and claw marks on most doorways, dog height, and allegedly they'd been leaving the animals confined into singular rooms when they went off on business. Otherwise the house was big in a long way, being only one story with one room having like a lofty space, and thus it had this long hallway running through the building, and I swear to God, going to the bathroom at night raised goosebumps every time, since I had to walk through it to get to the bathroom. Of course, this could all be attributed to me just being a scaredy cat. However, I also started feeling like I was being constantly watched by something, and I wound up changing my room since my old room used to have windows on ground level and the new one had a window so far up that anything that wasn't taller than a human couldn't reach. There was a point in time where I got a bit braver and would take some walks around the nearby roads to prove to myself there wasn't anything there, but then I wound up almost getting run over by a deer, who was admittedly about as surprised as I was, and then having another incident where I literally ran all the way home because my instincts were simply telling me to. I don't have a grandiose story like everything was silent, like people often do, but my senses just screamed at me to run and not look back, and I'm not the type to deny that sort of instinct. The part where the story becomes more than just my paranoia comes right after I moved away at 16, which, while I liked living around horses, was a weight off my chest as I could actually walk around my home without constant fear of the unknown, when my mom began telling me some of the things she hadn't told me when I still lived with her because she knew I'd freak out. She informed me, shockingly, that wolves had been sighted in our area in recent months. While this doesn't validate all my paranoia, it certainly validates the most recent sightings. She also confirmed that the wolves had killed several deer, the closest of which was a deer that was killed directly across the road on the field by our house. I hadn't seen it since I had been away, but I had actually observed other carcasses in the area and had noted them as a bit weird. That wasn't the worst part, though. The story that really made me happy I'd moved away comes from my mom very casually mentioning to me that one morning she'd gone out to feed the horses as usual, 4 to 5 a.m., before having to head to work, but as soon as she'd stepped out of the house, she'd noticed something was off. We had motion sensor lights on the corner of the stable, so you had to walk a good few meters into the pitch darkness on the mornings to get them to activate. My mom had been walking out with our cats, and while they usually go happily ahead, that morning they'd seemed very reluctant to go past the porch light. My mom is fearless, though, and she just marched into the darkness. When the stable light had gone off, she'd seen a wolf lurking by the stable corner in the dark. It had run off when the light came on, but Mom had noticed it for a moment. It had probably been just curious, checking out if there was any easy food around the area. Wolves aren't stupid enough to try and eat the horses, and she wasn't even totally sure if it was actually a wolf or something else. This news made me rather unhappy, though, but I hoped that the wolves had only come around the area after I got my license for a moped and stopped taking the school bus. If anyone has questions or similar stories, I would love to read them in the replies. I think the house and forest had bad vibes from the past owners and predators, but I may just be easily spooked by even the slightest scary things. When I was in my early 20s, I liked camping alone, sometimes just for an overnighter. I lived in Tasmania for a year at about that time, too. So there is a great walk at the southernmost tip of Tasmania, at SE Cape, that starts at Cockle Creek, and the first part is well maintained, running through some of the most amazing bush you will find in Australia, a peat bog, a creek, and some rainforest. I used to do that walk a lot. So one night I'm lying in my comfy bed where I lived in a brick apartment in Hobart, the capital of Tas. And I start thinking about a ravine I noticed on one of my walks running up from the peat bog between two hills, and it looked quite beautiful, heavily wooded, and I thought that maybe I should climb up the ravine and camp over the other side of the hills somewhere. I could see it quite clearly in my mind's eye, as clear as if I were there. In my mind's eye, I followed the ravine over the hills where I wanted to camp. Now I had never seen what was over the hill. This was all just my imagination based on what I knew the terrain in the area was like, and I imagined a spot there in a tiny clearing beside a huge tall tree and my little dome tent set up and me camping there the night. And then I felt like I was being watched, and it freaked me out. I wasn't there. I knew I wasn't there. I was lying in bed at home, thinking/imagining what it would be like to camp there. But I felt exactly like so many hundreds of people's stories here. I couldn't shake it. The more I thought about it, the more fear I felt. I had goosebumps. The thing is that there are no large predators in Australia, and even less in Tasmania, no dingoes or foxes in Tas, so I have never been afraid of bears, cougars, wolves, or anything like that. Also, I am over 6 feet and built like a barrel. I could see this little clearing so clearly in my mind, and I felt like there was something dangerous there, something like a big predator, and it was going to pounce. Anyway, I stopped thinking about it, and it took half an hour before I could shake it off and fall asleep. Needless to say, I never did do that camping trip. I find it really interesting that you don't even have to be there to get that feeling. I don't even know if this little clearing really exists or not, but the feeling was real, and my body's response to it was real. I have to admit that when I did that walk alone, I could feel eyes on me, but from far away, and that I was fine as long as I stayed on the track. I would usually come across another 2 to 6 people in groups of 2 on that track, so I suppose I felt safe because it was well used. I have felt this once since then, but not so strongly. This was on the mainland, and the bush in most of Australia is so open that you can see for hundreds of yards around you. But there was a place that I felt something watching me once, but not that it was going to try and attack me. Back in the winter of 2001, my youngest son and I were on our way from Boise, Idaho, to Medford, Oregon. We had taken a car trailer to his old place in Boise in order to haul his non-running Jeep to his new place in Medford. We hit an area of heavy snow in the southern Cascades around 2 a.m. It took 45 minutes or so to get down the mountain. We had, of course, been drinking coffee to stay alert. About 25 miles west of the pass, it became obvious that the last few quarts of coffee had to be drained. We stopped at a wide spot in the road near a summer tourist haunt, deserted in winter. There is a gas station and ice cream joint on the west side of the road, closed this time of year, and no town or settlement within 30 miles. This is tall timber country and unsettled. Across the road is a small parking area for the ice cream joint. It is paved and about 200 feet wide and 80 feet deep. I pulled in, and as I stepped out with the .45 on my hip, it occurred to me in a flash that grabbing the 590 Mossy would be good. As we walked to the far end of the area to be well off the road, the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. The area directly to our front was open with a depth of 50 yards and a width of 100 yards. The night was clear and cold, 8 to 10 inches of snow on the ground, and with a moon almost full, so we could see quite well. While standing and taking a leak, with my son about 15 feet to my right, I saw, as if springing from the earth in front of us across the open area, 10 or 12 creatures moving rapidly back and forth in sort of a thatch weave pattern. These things, not human men, were close to 7 feet tall, thin, bipedal with long arms, medium-length gray fur, and damned fast on their feet. I brought the shotgun up and slid the safety off as my son was drawing his .45. I don't know if I can adequately explain the overwhelming feeling of menace, but here goes. I had been operating on pure instinct since I had stepped from the pickup. The rotten feeling hit me a split second before the things arrived. The feeling, instinct, was that we were prey and subject to a terrible death and to being slaughtered and eaten, not a logical process, gut feeling, and massively overwhelming. As they were moving about in front of us, more appeared and mixed among them, all the while running about fast in front of us. Son and I were backing toward the truck. I would not present my back to them, and some of them peeled off right and left in an encirclement movement. They were rolling in fast from the sides now. I could smell and feel their presence. We got to the truck loaded on adrenaline and ready to kill, as we both knew we were in grave danger. We piled into the truck, locked the doors. I had keys out and ready. As my butt neared the seat, I had the engine lit, the trans in gear, and the gas pedal mashed in one motion. Adrenaline is great stuff. As we fled, something very close by let out an ululating scream of rage and pain. I believe one or more of the group had gotten really close to us in their pursuit, and I ran over the foot of one of them. Yeah, they were that close. We rolled onto the highway, and I told my son to watch the bed of the pickup as well as the trailer. He already was indexed to the rear with a shotgun. We hauled ass for at least 20 miles before the feeling of grave danger started to abate. The feeling that nailed both of us, as we discussed soon afterward, was that we were prey and soon to be slaughtered and eaten. I am not easily led and neither believe nor disbelieve all the Bigfoot, ghost, and werewolf stuff. In fact, I am skeptical. Son was speaking with a coworker about 6 months later who had grown up in Prospect, Oregon, about 30 miles south of Union Creek, where the incident took place. He asked Jake if he had ever heard of any strange goings-on in the area. Jake went ashy white and pretty much retold the above tale. He says to avoid the place at night. A family friend, a 25-year-old retired police officer who was known for his keen observation skills, shared a similar story from the previous year. I told my wife of this event. Of course, she looked at me at the beginning as though I had developed a third eyeball in the center of my forehead. That was from shock. She did believe me but did not wish to hear any details. She said the tale gave her chills. As I write this, the hair on the back of my neck and forearms is standing up. I have not gone back to explore and would not without a large group of shotgun and flamethrower equipped men with me. Son and I are both sane, sober persons and not taken to hysteria. We were wide, very awake as things transpired. We saw and smelled what was there. As a sidebar, neither of us heard footfalls from the creatures. They were silent until I heard one as we were getting the hell out of there. To my knowledge, and I have researched, there is nothing that matches these creatures, unless one considers old legends and folk tales of were-creatures. To conclude, I have to fall back on Elmer Keith's famous line, "Hell, I was there. Best regards." photographed and chased miles into the woods. I was 14 years old when I went camping in a small area of land in western Maryland, where many of my mom's family members had small cabins. We were related to everyone on the mountain, which was private property in the middle of nowhere. We grew up spending the summers around the campfire, telling scary stories and running around with all of my cousins. Quick explanation of layout. Imagine a large capital T for a road. The Savage River ran 150 feet above the T. If you went left on the T, it would take you past multiple family houses but also dense forest that cut off the road. If you went all the way to the right of the T, it was my mom's tiny cabin, where we stayed. I often went off on my own, preferring it that way. I was about to do just that when my aunt asked to tag along. She's 14 years older than I am and a big kid. She had pink hair at the time, was covered in tattoos, and is almost 6 feet tall, so not an easily intimidated woman. So I had decided that we'd go all the way to the left into the dense forest, and she's fine with that, admitting she'd come with me so she could smoke a joint and keep out of sight of my disapproving grandmother. Now, I was a good kid, and even though she offered me a hit, the thought of drugs still scared me, so I declined. At the end of the road was a super rough dirt path into the woods, with the river still running 150 feet above the path. If you were to walk towards the river, it would go on a downward slope. A few miles in, you'll actually come across one of those legendary random staircases that lead to nowhere. On this particular day I had taken the dirt path and had walked down the 150 feet along the river, watching the fish and crawdads scurry by as my aunt got high as a kite, a little bit behind me. I was in my own little world when I suddenly heard a click noise that brought me back to reality. I look up and around, confused. Then my eyes land on some man I've never seen before, standing across the river from me, no more than 15 feet from me. He must have just walked out of the woods on the other side of the river. It's summer, but he's in a black jacket and raggedy jeans and is holding one of those old, cheap, non-digital yellow cameras that you would roll the top and it'd click to be able to take another picture. I was stunned because I had never seen anyone other than my family anywhere around the area in all the years I'd been going up there. He smiled at me, then slightly lowered his camera. He was older, probably in his 40s, and very scruffy. He stood tall and appeared somewhat slender. He takes a step forward, and I, in turn, take a step back. He scrolls the top of the camera and points it directly at me again. I find myself utterly speechless and can only retreat further, nearly tripping over a rock in the process. That's when my aunt stumbles through the trees and is in mid-sentence about how much she missed being high when she stopped and stared at the man. I was just staring at her at this point, frozen like a deer in headlights. I slowly turn, and he's not looking at my aunt, he's staring right at me. He clicks the camera again at us. And then he does something that makes my blood run cold and turns the situation from weird to terrifying. He does the tut-tut-tut thing with his finger and points to what looks like a knife sheathed and strapped to his hip. He then points a finger that he slices across his throat. At that moment, I switched to automatic mode. I spun around and began barreling through the trees, grabbing onto my aunt. My heart pounded as I ran, though I could have sworn I heard one more click before I could hear the splashing from behind me. I almost collapsed because my legs felt like jelly. The river is really deep in parts, but where I had been, we were at a point where the water would have been only thigh deep to a grown man. I tore upwards and ran blindly, like a rabbit from a fox. When we saw the stairs, my aunt quickly yanked me to the other side and slid down beside me as we caught our breath. I was wheezing so loud I had to cover my mouth to try to muffle the sound. I peer around, but the trees are so dense I can't see the river from the stairs, but even with my hammering heartbeat, I hear the snapping of branches, like someone barreling through the forest. Now, I am very, very scared. It's not a straight trail back into my family property. You have to weave around, and in spots it dips and gets rocky, so you have to do it like an S shape to get through. There are random rocks everywhere, and I could easily twist an ankle or hit a tree in my panic. We also tread carefully and look where we're going because there are so many snakes. I'm crying and wheezing uncontrollably, and we still have a few miles to go before we reach the first section of my family's property. My mind is racing, but I know we can't stay. Neither of us had any type of weapon, and staying here was making it harder for me to convince myself to run as paralyzing terror crept in. My legs and arms are already cut up, and before I can decide what to do, my aunt pulls me towards the T road, desperately, just stumbling and running. I don't make it more than another mile until I misstep and trip over a branch, tripping and smacking headfirst into a tree. I crumple over and taste blood. I had bitten through my lip in the fall. I'm dazed, but my adrenaline is still pumping. So I scramble to a tree as my aunt turns and notices I'm not right behind her. She scrambles back and drops to her knees in front of me, whispering. I'm dazed, but she keeps repeating that we need to keep going. I'm shaking so bad I don't think I can walk, much less run. I probably have another 1.5 miles until I'm on my family's property, but another 2 until we're at an occupied cabin, my grandmother's. My ears are ringing, and I'm hardly paying attention to my aunt's frantic pleas. I completely psych myself out again and keep looking behind me, but I don't see anything. She decides that she's not going to waste any more time because of stupid me and half drags me up and forward. I hobble forward as quick as I can as she continues to pull me too quickly. The rest is a blur until we break through the woods. Most of my family wasn't there at the time, so we only stopped when we made it to my grandmother's, and I just ran in sobbing. No one locks their doors around there, and my grandmother takes one horrified look at me and my aunt, who is equally cut up and scared looking, and yells for my grandfather, who promptly takes over and grabs his rifle. I can't put into sentences what just happened, so my aunt takes over, leaving out the part about her being high as a kite. He and my grandmother go cabin to cabin, gathering the men and their guns, as well as warning the women and children about what just occurred. There's no signal up there, so calling the sheriff wasn't an option, and to get up to the mountain if they left immediately would take over an hour. It's getting dark, the roads leading up to the property are so windy and steep you'd have to be out of your mind to try to drive up them in the dark anyway. My mother eventually got word and came over. She took one look at my aunt and said that I had probably just gotten high with her, which in turn made us overly paranoid, and when we saw the random fisherman who was trespassing, we jumped to conclusions and it probably startled him as much as he had startled us. She continued by saying I probably just imagined he was taking my picture or that he began chasing us, though my aunt had been the one to repeatedly retell the story. My aunt stood up and yelled at my mother, saying that I was a good kid and didn't do anything and that we were telling the truth. They began screaming at each other, and my grandmother made them both stop and told them to grow up. Even with the men of my family scouring the woods, they never saw any sign of the man we had encountered in the woods. Everyone on the mountain locked their doors that night, though, for the first time in a long time. And to this day, all I can wonder is if I'm a part of some creepy picture collection, but considering what could have happened, maybe if I had been alone like normal, I could live with that. In 2016, a friend went camping at the Stillwater Tent and Trailer Park, to the west of Nipigon, Ontario, in the Thunder Bay area. He woke up in the middle of the night to what he said were 2 grays. He couldn't move or scream, and the last thing he remembered was a sharp pain just above the clavicle next to the neck. When he came out of the tent in the morning, one of his fishing friends was alarmed at the blood that was on his t-shirt on his shoulder. When they inspected his sleeping bag, they found more blood. They took him to the provincial hospital, where one of the doctors said that something had punctured his skin and gone alongside the muscle at least 2.5 centimeters. The hole was about 2 millimeters and scabbed, and an X-ray showed something the size of a 1206 surface mount resistor was at the bottom of the puncture. He elected to wait and have it removed back in the States. It took 2 days to get back to Indiana, and then another day for him to see the doctor, which confirmed the object was there. They decided to remove it 2 days later in an outpatient procedure at Parkview in Fort Wayne. The morning of the procedure, he woke to find more blood on his sheets and pillow and went in for the 10:45 a.m. appointment. When the doctor did a scan to confirm the location of the piece for removal, it was no longer there. It was in tissue at a location where it could not have moved by itself, and the doctor noted that the penetration into the body showed trauma as if something had been put in him again, which disturbed the tissue that was in the process of healing, yet the skin penetration at the surface showed recent scarring, which one would expect of a wound 3 months old. Ron now sleeps with a proximity alarm and an IR alarm, which has gone off once since the event. Since then, he now sleeps with an S&WMP 2.040 cal on the nightstand. Since 2016 he's never had another problem, but in 2017 he had a full scan of the upper torso, which confirmed no foreign material in the body. And since that event, he will only go fishing with the guys if they are all in the same tent together. A scary story. I live alone with my 2 dogs, who enjoy taking walks in the evening deep in the forest, which is tucked away in a very small town that is rarely visited. The forest is about a 20-minute drive from my house, and my dogs love it because it's quiet and they don't like loud noises. During the drive, I saw a homeless guy in a tent where I normally take my dogs on the walk, so I went a bit further down to the right, and when I parked and went to the right, I saw the same guy in a different tent. I was really confused, so I just took them on the normal trails, and he came up to me and said that he loves pets and had some before he was homeless. I felt bad for him, so I gave him $10. When he didn't ask for anything, he then told me about a dog park. I was in a town with a population of about 3 people, so I was confused. However, when I arrived, I saw the same homeless guy. This was a 5-minute drive from the forest, and he had a huge creepy smile and a hand behind his back. The cat that was following me gave me a run. Look. It looked terrified, and my dogs were confused, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I went back to my car and drove home. A few months later, the homeless man was on the news, and it turned out he would lure people there and do awful stuff to them, but I still don't know how he got there so fast. My grandfather's farm. This story happened 2 years ago on my now gone grandfather's farm. Before I delve into the story, allow me to provide a brief description of the farm, which includes a large wooden house and 2 sheds located at its back. And at least half a football field-sized grass field that ends in the woods, and on the left side of the building, there are some deep woods that go for some bit. In front of the building are different crops, including corn, carrots, some apple trees, and my grandfather's tomato garden, and some animals, including rabbits, chickens, and 2 livestock guardians, well, dogs. On the right side is a small building to hold our tractor and some other vehicles that can fit in there. When I first was on the farm, it didn't feel right. It felt like I was being watched, but that feeling faded away after some time. I did what I could to help on the farm, and one morning I discovered that one of the dogs was bloody and had a broken paw. I told my grandfather, and he went to the vet with the dog. After some time, I checked in on the rabbits. The rabbits area resembled a battlefield, with a rabbit's leg and an ear strewn along the fence. Called my grandfather right after that and said what I see. He was angry, my grandfather, he lost 3 rabbits to some unknown animal. I and my grandfather were thinking about it. What could it be? A black bear? A brown bear? A wolf? We didn't know. My grandfather had the idea to borrow some trail cameras from buddies of his and asked to borrow them for a bit. The grandfather set up 2 on the animal area, 1 on the garden and 1 from the house pointing towards the apple trees and cornfield, and 2 at the back of the building. 4 days passed, I got the dog back, put on a cast, and spent some time inside. I believe it was in the middle of the summer when my friends Carl, Jake, Mike, and Jacob called me and said, "Could we come over and do a small camping trip in the woods near your grandpa's farm?" I asked my grandpa and said it was okay, so the next day I and my friends got ready to go camping. But my grandfather stopped us and dragged me inside for a minute to hand me one of his shotguns, the double barrel, and said, "Be careful, look out for bears," while handing me like 9 to 10 shotgun shells. After that I put the double barrel on my back and headed off to the woods with my friend on the camping trip. We were not so deep in the woods, I could barely see the building and the 2 sheds. When we picked the spot we wanted, we unpacked. One of my 4 friends, Mike, started to set up one of those giant tents where you could stand inside and not touch the top. After that we created a fire pit, and then I and Jacob started the fire, standing back while the fire started. After that, Jake pulled out some food and drinks, some colas and waters, with some meats and sweets too. After that, we prepared food, conversed, and enjoyed ourselves. Occasionally, we heard something in the vicinity but did not pay attention until Mike mentioned, "I believe I see a bear." This prompted me to recall the gun I had forgotten on my back. I removed the gun from my back, loaded it with 2 shells, and observed the animal that was fleeing, which was a deer. Subsequently, we indulged in some amusements. As the evening progressed, 2 of my friends retired to bed, while I remained awake. Jake and Carl were still up talking about school and what we have done in the summer. The loudest twig ever snapped from deeper in the woods, echoing for a brief moment before the forest fell silent. And then Jacob and Mike woke up, came out, and asked what it was. I said it was a twig snapping by some animal, but the more twigs started to snap, the closer the sound came, so Jacob went into the tent, grabbing one of those high-power flashlights, and came out and scanned the woods for a bit. Until we heard more twigs snap from 2 directions, I took the gun, took out a headlamp, and started to scan the forest. The gun pointed towards the darkness, something was coming closer to us, so I did a warning shot into the air and heard from multiple directions that something just ran away. After that we calmed down, sat down, and pulled out a radio, one of those handheld ones, you know, and started to play some music from it. 2 hours later, I heard again twigs snap, but this time it sounded like it was from multiple directions, and we started to scan the woods. I heard as the twig snapping got louder, and then I heard as my friend screamed, "What the F-euro% is that?" As I looked towards the area where their flashlight was moving, I saw a glimpse of some kind of thing running. I flicked the gun towards the area where I thought it was and shot. It hit something that sounded like a fox if it had a very deep vocal cord screaming like a demon from hell. That's when we all just ran for the grass field, leaving our stuff behind. When we got to the grass field, we still heard whatever it was in the woods, seeing something past the not so well burning fire, so I put 2 new shells into the gun and fired while screaming at the top of my lungs, "Leave this property or I'm going to call the cops." I see my grandfather at one of the sheds with my friend holding a phone to his ear and talking to 911 while holding a hunting rifle in another hand. I backed up all the way to the shed, scared for my life, and then my grandpa said everything's going to be fine. I called the cops. After that day, my parents came, picked me up, and went home. Some days later, my grandpa caught a glimpse of the things on the trail cameras moving into the cornfield and the other camera of something peeking out from behind the shed far away. My grandpa believed that a wolf pack or coyotes were terrorizing us on the farm, but he didn't know for sure. I heard from my dad that grandpa asked some of his hunting buddies to keep an eye on the property. After that, nothing significant happened. I have many a story. Even though I grew up in suburbia and the city, I spent a decent amount of my youth camping both in upstate NY and slogging it through the Everglades and areas of North and Central Florida. I'll start with one that remains with me to this day, some 20 years later. My end-of-the-year field trip in 8th grade was up to the Peace River for 3 days of camping, canoeing, and artifact sifting in the Peace River. The latter, I believe, is a catalyst for my experience. Most of you know that Florida is rife with Native American history. The Peace River was an important source of water for tribes. The week prior to my trip, it had rained substantially, even by Florida standards. While sifting for fossilized manatee bones and shark teeth, our class started coming up with native clay beads, pottery shards, and arrowheads. It seems there was a previously undiscovered virtual mound that the recent storms had unearthed and sent smaller items into the river. There were no warnings not to take anything home with us. So we gleefully took our unexpected and really cool finds back to camp. That night, after the requisite campfire stories and s'mores, we went to our tents, exhausted from the several-mile canoe trip and excitement of finding a new burial mound, ready to pass out. And we did. All night I kept being woken up by someone whispering in my ear, only to wake up and find my 2 tent mates sound asleep. The whispering was as if someone were 2 inches from my ear, and at one point I felt the pressure of someone placing a hand upon my shoulder. It was unintelligible what was said. After the 3rd or 4th time, I was really annoyed, and nature called. It was midwinter, and growing up in southern FL, it was frigid. I accept teasing for this. And I didn't want to get out of my warm bag. But you know. So I grudgingly got my shoes on and tried to wake one of the 2 to come with, to no avail. The camp was completely silent. Only some breaths and muffled snores from the tents. But no strange feelings. Yet. We were a way off from the campground, and I had to make a 5 to 10 minute walk to the outhouse. I could hear the groans of alligators, and their eyes reflected menacingly when I crossed the wooden bridge on the path to get to the main camp with RVs. Everything went fine until I crossed that bridge on my return trip. As I was stepping off into land, their gators started making strange sounds, and there was thrashing. I looked back, and they were leaving. After the thrashing subsided and the water became still, I got that feeling. A slight fog was now our camp, but it was kind of offset and not complete as normal fog would be. It was definitely concentrated in one small area, with my tent near ground zero. The air felt even colder, and there were no sounds from trees, chock full of turkey vultures, only the sleeping sounds of my classmates and an odd pulsing heartbeat-like sound. It wasn't mine, as it was just off from my heartbeat. I heard a murmuring sound that I couldn't process and then a few soft pops. I whipped my light over to see what looked like 2 Native Americans, made of the fog, standing near a tent with a trail of fog not quite formed into more than a blob, going through one of the tents on the boys' side. They didn't react to my flashlight at all. The blob moved further into the tent through its wall, but I assumed that would have happened with or without my light, as the men standing didn't appear to react. It felt like time stood still as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I do recall that they were very detailed yet less dense by the head than the feet. And their calves to feet were off, as it stemmed from the strange fog. What brought me back into motion was something grabbing my pant leg, and before I could scream, I saw it was a parent volunteer. She put her finger to her mouth to say quiet, and I got down and into the tent with her. She asked me if I saw it too. I'm not sure what happened next, but I know it was real as I woke up in her tent. Sadly, nothing more was said about it, only a few glances between me and their mom. I am sure the others took their finds home, but I dug a hole where the tents were after we'd broken camp and buried my glazed Cheerio-shaped beads so they would stay where they belonged. After our trip, my teacher received a letter from the University of Florida thanking our class for assisting in locating an unknown burial mound. There was something unique to it anthropologically, but the details are lost to my memory. I hope it was preserved enough that those Indians can rest in peace. Sleepless nights. These are real stories from my childhood/early teens. They might not be very scary in a paranormal sense, as they all have logical explanations, but as a child, what was happening was sending shivers down my spine. So I live in Poland, and as a child, I used to visit my grandma a lot. She lives in a rural area. Not necessarily cut off from the outside world, as there's a town 5 or 6 miles away. However, as a child raised in Krakow, the second biggest city in Poland, I surely felt like it was pretty isolated. The village is surrounded by woods. The woods stretch for miles upon miles around the village. My grandma lives in a small wooden house, just a few hundred feet away from the forest. Her house is so old even she doesn't know its history. I loved visiting my grandma, but spending nights at her house was a completely different story. Every smallest sound would make me jerk awake. And there was a plethora of sounds. Martins and mice running through the attic, dogs barking, boars and deer rummaging through her vegetable garden. And there was one more sound keeping me awake at night. To this day I'm not sure if I've dreamt it, but I hope that was the case. It was a knocking sound. The first time I heard it, I thought it was Granny's dog trying to get in. We've got a door leading to the porch and then another to the house itself. Dogs and cats slept on the porch but were never let into the house. I went to open the porch door, but when I went onto the porch, my dog was right there, sleeping soundly. My immediate thought was that someone might have been in desperate need of help, but the door had no peephole, and there was no way in hell I'd open the door in the middle of the night without knowing what's on the other side. So, as silently as I could, I went back to bed, listening closely to the knocks. I figured it couldn't have been anyone in need of help. The knocks were slow and regular. Almost too regular. The following morning I asked my grandma if she'd heard anything, but she denied. At that moment I felt quite relieved, thinking the whole thing was just a weird dream. But when the night came, my ease faded. There it was. The knocking. Slow and regular as the night before. I hid under my duvet, shaking in fear until I fell asleep. Since then, my nights at grandma's would always look the same. I would make sure the porch door is locked and hide under my duvet, awaiting the knocks. These knocks would constantly bug me. As a child, I didn't have much to worry about, so creepy fever dreams were big enough of a problem for me to be constantly on my mind. I decided I have to check it out, just to put my mind at ease. The next night at my grandma's, I was mentally ready. I made a plan that was supposed to work out perfectly. It was winter, and the path to our porch was covered in snow. My plan was to wait for the knocking out and go check whether there were any footsteps left in the snow, and I did as I planned. I sat through the persistent knocking, curled under my duvet, and when I was sure it had stopped for the night, I went to the door. I stepped out onto the porch, waiting for the knocking to start again. But it didn't. I unlocked the porch door and peered outside. There was nothing in the snow. I went back to bed feeling as relieved as ever, convinced that now, when I debunked it, my strange recurrent dream wouldn't come again. As you can guess, I was wrong. The next night I felt like the knocking was even louder and more persistent than before. At that moment I didn't even feel fear anymore. I was angry. I jumped up, deciding I was going to hound whatever it is that disturbs my sleep with dogs. I was about to unlock the house door when the knocking stopped. I just stood there with my hand over the door handle when suddenly the knocking started again. It wasn't coming from the porch door anymore. It was coming from the house door. That weird feeling of the floor collapsing under my feet came over me. I couldn't move for a few painstakingly long seconds. I don't recall it, but I must have screamed because something stirred on the porch, and Granny's dogs started barking like crazy. I must have woken them up. And I don't know what it was, my scream or my dogs that scared the knocker away, but I never heard the knocking again. It still bothers me to this day, as I'm uncertain if it was merely a dream. Another story comes from my early, or rather mid-teens. I was maybe 15 at the time and quite an adventurer. I loved to this day, actually, long walks in the moonlight, doing dumb and dangerous things to impress my friends and cousins, and other stuff unreasonable 15-year-olds like. That night I was sitting with my cousin around an already dying down campfire. The rest of the family went to sleep as it must have been past 3 a.m. These were the last nights of summer, warm and humid. We were just chatting, enjoying the forest-smelling breeze, looking out for shooting stars. I've always had a thing for warm late summer nights, as I've noticed they usually turn out to be the best nights of my life, albeit somehow regretful. I was hoping for this night to be no different. Just two brothers, looking into the night sky, catching up on each other's lives. But it definitely turned out to be the creepiest night of my life, so far, that is. We were chatting about nothing and everything, a girl he kinda likes, a girl I kinda like, the new games we bought, I don't really remember, when we heard the most agonizing, hair-raising scream ever. It sounded like a child being skinned alive, someone in great pain, and like something otherworldly we couldn't put our fingers on at the same time. We heard it again, a tad bit closer to us this time. Or at least so we thought. After careful consideration, we decided we're not kids anymore, and we wouldn't run away and hide like cowards. This might have been a lost child that got injured. We felt like we had to help them. Or maybe we were just too proud to admit we were scared in front of each other. Anyhow, we retrieved 2 flashlights from my grandma's shed and set out into the woods. We immediately regretted our decision, as the flashlights were running low, leaving us with only a dim, shaky, bluish light to guide us. We were trying our best to pinpoint a particular part of the woods that the screams were coming from. And it was just impossible. They were seemingly coming from a different place every time. We established it must have been the echo, though, because how many lost children at a time could possibly be in one forest? We went into the woods. It was a 2-minute walk from my grandma's house, so we didn't really decide how exactly we were supposed to look for a lost child in a pitch-black forest while only being led by their screams echoing through the trees. None of us would have ever admitted it, but we were also scared shitless. The area was ominously silent and full of night sounds at the same time. At least that's how it felt to me at the time. The sounds of birds we startled and a little stream flowing weren't relaxing, as they are during the day. Our shitty flashlights were only giving off enough light for us to see where we stepped. We were just walking towards the agonizing screams, or at least to where they were approximately coming from, without a single word, as if even breathing too loudly was supposed to awaken something very evil. I had my theories as to what was exactly going on in the forest, and so did my cousin, but he would never tell me. Otherwise I would have found out he was scared. After a painfully long 15-minute walk, we finally got to the place the screams were coming from. There was no child there. On top of that, we realized the screams had stopped like 5 minutes ago. I started looking around frantically. This part of the woods was basically the top of a hill, so the visibility was slightly better than down there, around the stream. We've turned off our flashlights a moment ago. The batteries ran out quicker than we thought. Suddenly I stopped in my tracks. I noticed some faint movement between the trees. I knew my cousin noticed it too, since he was standing behind me, completely motionless and breathless. I felt watched and surrounded, and I had no idea by what exactly. My thoughts were ranging anywhere from wild animals through a serial killer to something supernatural, even though I never believed in anything not proven by science. Something stirred in the nearby bushes. I grabbed my cousin's arm. We started running. A herd of deer ran the other way. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest. I said something along the lines of "Deer, huh?" And then we fell silent. The next morning we felt pretty stupid when Grandma said she couldn't sleep because of the deer mating sounds. However, when we checked out the infamous mating sounds on the internet, they weren't quite the same. Indeed, they were similar, but not identical. They were emotionless, they were lacking that intense, deep sorrow we've heard the night prior. Creepy lady in the woods. Throughout many years, there's been a bunch of rumors going around about people seeing some weird shit in this one forest not too far from me. I have been in this forest a bunch of times before, and there's been some weird random shit there. Me and some friends once found a bed, a closet and some candles just in the middle of nowhere. But this one day we were playing basketball after school on a summer day. The court was right by our elementary school, and right behind it was the forest. At some point, one of us airballed, and the ball rolled down into the forest. I went to get it, and as I walked into the forest, I saw a lady in a dirty white jacket holding a white plastic bag and what looked to be a knife. She was about 250 meters away from us, so it was kind of hard to tell if it was a knife or not. I remember her just starting towards us. And my dumbass, of course, tried to shout, "What are you doing?" and didn't get a response. After about 20 seconds, she walked deeper into the forest. My friends were pretty spooked out, but I wanted to investigate. We continued to play basketball for a little bit, and the next day at school we went into the forest to look for her again. After walking around for a while, we found a white plastic bag, which we presumed was hers since it had the same store branding on it as she had. It was closed, and we decided to open it. We found a voodoo doll-looking thing made out of styrofoam, and the head was a cabbage head. Everything was held together with needles. Of course, the idiots that we were, we decided to destroy the doll and mess with it. While this story may not be particularly frightening, I felt compelled to share it due to its peculiar nature. Has anyone else seen this thing, or was it a freak of nature? This happened when I was about 11 or 12 and had just moved into a new house around the corner from my sister's. I live at a dead end with a mini forest thing next to me. I say that because it's a hill with a lot of trees and then a road at the bottom. But when we were here for about 6 months, I was sitting on the porch at night with my dad, and I looked over at the road in front of my house at the cutoff where the forest starts, and I saw this like very, very large mutant, disfigured bunny thing, and it turned and looked at me for a split second before running into the woods, and I turned freaked to ask my dad if he had seen it, also damn near. Dragged him in the house, trying to get away from the thing. He said he didn't and asked me what I saw, so I tried to describe it, but I can't, and I still can't. If you were to put what I saw in a lineup of other animals, I could point it out right away. I remember exactly what it looked like, I just can't draw or put it into words, but anyways, I'm trying to tell him what I saw. I tell him it looked like a very, very big, deformed bunny, and he tells me my sister said she saw it at her house around the corner. I still live in this house, and I've never seen it again, but I can remember exactly what it looks like. Has anyone seen something like this, or am I crazy? The first time I ever experienced that feeling that it's time to get out of Dodge, or else, was also the most intense. Back in the fall of 2017, I was taking care of my grandparents full time. Every day or two I would get a few hours off to go teach up on campus and maybe take a shower. Other than that, it was full-time dementia care. I was bone tired and losing my mind a little. It had been almost 3 months of this at this point. I relay this simply to set the context for my mental state. In mid-September I got my mother and brother to agree to swap in for me for a weekend and set out for the Denali Highway with 2 friends. We left town at about 7 p.m. and hit the turnoff in Paxson at about 11:30 p.m. I drive slow, baby your truck and it will baby you. About 15-ish miles down the highway, the pavement ends, and, especially that time of year, you end up on very terrible washboards. A few miles after the pavement ended, I'm coming around an S-curve, and there's a Subaru parked on a pullout with a massive light bar. He's parked so that the light bar is pointed directly into oncoming traffic, and there's a man leaning against the front of the hood looking out into the road. After the fact, I realized that his setup was perfect for getting a good look at who's in passing vehicles without your face or license being visible, but at the time I figured he was waiting for a buddy. It was hunting season after all. Our destination was 7 Mile Lake, and thus the 7 Mile Lake Trailhead. The trailhead is at the end of a mile-long straight stretch when you come in from the east end of the highway, and I was about halfway down this stretch going along at 20 to 25 miles per hour when I noticed another vehicle in my rear view, light bar man. When I was just about to pull off, I looked again and saw that he was now almost caught up. To do this, he would have had to go roughly 40 to 50 miles per hour on a road that routinely kills vehicles and trailers. What I thought was, oh good, I'm about to turn off so he won't have to slow down. I turned into the trailhead. He slowed down to about 5 miles per hour and just crawled by, getting a good look at us, I suppose. Then he sped right back up and off into the night. I pulled the truck into the right-hand side of the pull-off, let it idle for a minute to cool down the turbo, and shut her off. I woke up my 2 friends, who had both been asleep for the last hour, and we got out of the truck. That was when it hit me. I had never experienced it before, that feeling that is best summed up as if you don't leave, then very, very bad things will happen. I looked around, but it was a quiet night, and nothing seemed amiss. I asked my buddies if something felt wrong, and they both admitted that they had gotten that feeling as soon as they stepped out of the truck. One had actually pulled his AR-10 out and had it at the ready. Then we saw the other vehicle parked at the trailhead. I will simply describe it and what we found in it: a newer Ford Explorer, all doors unlocked except for the passenger door, which had a hand mark in the dust from being closed with the right hand as if turning to face something behind the car. Keys on the front driver's seat. 2 empty coffees in the cup holders from the long drive. Driving sandals and shoes in the footwells, as if they had just changed. 2 phones are still plugged into the cigarette lighter. 2 full hiking bags and a compound bow on the back seats and an empty fast food bag. In the back, a cooler that had spilled over from the washboards and left a few onions scattered. The hood was covered in evening condensation, except for a small patch in the center indicating the engine was still warm, parked for less than 3 hours that time of year. Stacked animal vertebrae on the antenna, probably caribou. A month expired sticker on the driver's rear window for membership in a youth group. On the back window, written in the fresh dust from the drive, was the word Moloch. We spent about 10 minutes looking at this vehicle, looking around for anybody, but there wasn't anybody around. That feeling of leave or die never went away. We were standing at the back of the vehicle, trying to make sense of what was obvious in retrospect, when another vehicle came down the highway in the same direction we had been traveling, another Subaru with a light bar going about 50 to 55 miles per hour, though this one didn't slow down to check us out. At that point we left. We drove 45 miles away to a backup site for the night. The next morning we drove back. The Ford was still there, well frosted over from the night but untouched since last night, and no sense of danger now. We loaded up the 4-wheelers and made our way back to 7 Mile. We spent quite a bit of time looking over the tundra for anybody, but we were the only ones out there, We happened to be out between the two caribou seasons. We flipped a four-wheeler crossing a large creek and lost the beers. The entire time we were out in the mountains proper, we could hear massive rock falls and slides, though we never saw them. We all had a general sense of disquiet, as if we weren't welcome out there, and that evening a lone caribou spent an hour watching us and coming over a little bit at a time until it was about 50 feet off. Who knows? When we left the next morning, the ford was still there, still untouched. The onions in the back were starting to go off from the freezing and thawing. Back in civilization, I called in that ford as a possible abduction and gave my contact information, and the dispatcher said the single trooper that covers that area, bounded roughly by Delta Junction to Glen Ellen, might check it out in the morning. I called back a couple of weeks later to see if anything had come of it, and they had no record of my call, though they did have records of the calls I had made earlier in the year when my grandfather had hopped in the car and was driving around town unattended and demented. It's possible they wrote it off as nothing, but I did find out years later that both the local police and the troopers maintain a non-electronic records section for cases dealing with the occult and leave those strictly physical copies, so it's hard to say. Here's what I do know now. Moloch, also known as Moloch, is an ancient god of Canaan who is generally worshipped through the burnt offering of children/the young. The burning bull is usually associated with Moloch. Moloch still shows up these days, most notably a statue of Moloch in an art exhibit in Rome and the mock sacrifice to Moloch depicted in the footage of Bohemian Grove. There was other notable weirdness with our backup site the first night that I've left out, and some years later I ran across a very personable native who I asked about the general area. He told me that the eastern end of the Alaska Range is where the bad medicine men, skinwalkers, sort of, but not really, it's complicated, were either laid to rest or went to die. That part was unclear to me. Alaska is a big state, it's easy to get lost. I always go well armed in the woods anymore. Previous posters have mentioned that people are scarier than anything else in the woods, but I find that the intersection between people and the occult is just about as bad as it gets. This happened to me 2 years ago now, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. I've always tried to rationalize it but never could. I live in the countryside of Ireland, right in the middle of nowhere, so it's very rare that I hear noises outside, and when I do, 99% of the time it's a cow that's escaped the field beside us into our garden or our dog barking at a person walking by. But there is still that 1% of the time, and I can't explain what the 1% was. This happened on some night in late spring. The night was dark and clear, I could see every star in the sky. At around midnight I went into the kitchen to get a midnight snack, normal teenager activities. As I was getting my snack, I started hearing noises outside. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was probably some sort of animal, but it only got louder, so I opened the window to try to get a better look or be able to hear it better, and all that I could see was my dog standing beside the back door, not taking its eyes off the forest behind our house. But the noise was one of the worst things I've ever heard. The only way I can possibly explain it was metal being scraped but more croaky, I guess. What worried me most was how my dog wasn't barking at whatever it was she was scared of, which is unlike her, and she was a big dog, Newfoundland. The fact she wasn't barking made me believe it wasn't an animal, as my dog wouldn't have hesitated to get to it. But I couldn't explain it, so I brought the dog inside and went to bed, but it felt like the sound followed me to my room. Now the sound was at the front of my house, which didn't make sense because of how it got there so quickly. I decided to shut my curtains and try to get some sleep, and as soon as I pulled the covers over me, there was a tap on my window. I stayed under the covers listening to it, and it was a constant tap tap tap. It sounded like little stones were being thrown at my window. This carried on for I don't know how long, but I fell asleep eventually, and the next day I started talking to my neighbors, and I found out a man had moved into the house just around the corner from us. I asked around and found out things about him. He was supposedly not a law-abiding citizen, he had many run-ins with the guards, and it was said he was a major drug dealer and probably on some major drugs. A month later, there was a massive amount of weed and other drugs found in a shed down the road from me, and I never saw that man again. What I believe happened that night was the druggie was trying to torment me while he was high, but I have no idea how he was able to make that sound for at least 3 hours straight and then run around my house in less than a few seconds. How long was he there for? His timing was so perfect that it defies my understanding. Even today, I wonder what would have happened if I had gone to see it. What were his/its intentions? Christmas 2019, the location, my cabin in Savannah, Tennessee. The wife and I had invited her niece and family for a joint vacation. The visiting family has 3 children, a female drama queen aged 9, a boy aged 13, and another female who's 19. The 2 youngest spent their time outdoors during daylight hours being loud, bickering, in other words, acting like normal juvenile siblings. On Christmas Day we cooked a turkey outdoors using a Brinkmann propane-fired oilless turkey fryer that turned out amazing. At 9 p.m. I went onto the deck for a cigarette, and the 13-year-old, wanting some time away from his younger sister, went out first. I was a step behind him and his father was a step behind me. The scent of human feces was such that we all commented on the fact within a few seconds. The door being opened long enough for 3 persons to exit let in the smell so strong that the females sitting in the living room experienced the stench as well. The wind currents were coming from an angle that put a possible septic field leakage being downwind as unlikely. The scent 30 minutes later was less intense but still there. A lot of discussion followed. I later went out with a UV flashlight and a regular flashlight and was unable to find any evidence of a septic field leak. The next day the wife used our lawn tractor mower to mulch the leaves in the backyard and also couldn't find a source or evidence for the now gone smell. The next day my neighbor stopped by for a visit and told me that about 10 years ago something was making roars so loud one night that he decided there wasn't enough money in the world that could persuade him to investigate the source even if armed. We have a surveillance camera covering the camp driveway. To date, just stray dogs, maybe coyotes, as the distance was too far. The haunted forest behind Dan's building. For a little backstory, Daniel was my childhood's best friend from my neighborhood, and he lived in the building next to mine in the year 1993, if I remember correctly, but we all called him Dan for short. This is his story, and he swears it's totally true. Since Dan was 8 or 9 years old, his mother, his stepfather, and he moved to a small neighborhood in a city in South America, which is located in a valley and is surrounded by a big mountain on all sides. The neighborhood was on the east side of the city on a dead-end street of a closed neighborhood, but there were a lot of green areas all around it, such as small hills with big and small trees, plants, flowers, grass, 2 parks, and a sports court. When Dan and his family moved to the neighborhood, he was very happy because when they were getting there in his mom's car, he could see a lot of places where he could play in, so as a kid, that was very exciting for him. Even though the hills, woods, and plants that surrounded Dan's new neighborhood looked really nice during the day and while the sun was up, they looked very dark and creepy at night, and he thought they were really scary. He felt an ominous presence from those woods at night. At that age, Dan was afraid of many things: the dark, the woods, wolves, black dogs and cats, spiders, sharks, you name it, just like me, and this was because he was a total mama's boy at 5 years old and for most of his life. When Dan and I met for the first time, we were both playing in the park while our babysitters were watching us, and talking to each other. We immediately bonded and became friends because we had a lot of things in common. We started talking about our favorite TV shows and movies, such as Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, the X-Men cartoons, and Ninja Turtles, among many others. We played by pretending we were superheroes or other cartoon characters and running around on the merry-go-round, slides, swings, and plastic lightsabers, fighting as Jedis or Ninja Turtles. We never stayed in the park after dark because our sitters wouldn't let us or we were scared of the woods around it. However, Dan was not my only friend in the neighborhood. I introduced him to my other friends who lived in my building and other buildings and houses. Their names were the following: Eliza, Diego, JP, Mike, Laura, and Gerard. All of us were around the same age, and we all became great friends as the months went by because almost every afternoon we played sports, played in the park, trick or treated, had water balloon fights, played Nintendo together, climbed the hills and woods behind our buildings during the day, and did everything together. The neighborhood kids enjoyed making jokes about the haunted woods behind the buildings. At that time, we played hide and seek or cops and robbers, so we ran around the street until 7 p.m. because that was our curfew, and we had to do our boring homework, but Dan and I went to bed late at night in secret while we talked quietly on the phone. That night, it was like 9 or 10 p.m., I think, and Dan asked me the following: "Did you watch X-Men today?" "Yeah, dude, of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Did you see the fight against Apocalypse and the 4 Horsemen?" "Yeah, dude. That fight was awesome, I loved it." "Speaking of which, have you ever heard any eerie noises coming from behind your building at night?" "No, bro, I'm a deep sleeper, so I usually black out everything around me." "Wow. I wish I were that lucky. I usually can hear footsteps in those woods at night, and I also sleepwalk sometimes." "Well, I think it's time for me to go to sleep. See you tomorrow, and take care, bro." "Sure thing, man. Talk tomorrow, and take care, too." Dan hung up his favorite hamburger-shaped phone, sat down in bed, grabbed an old fantasy book about dragons that was on his nightstand, and started reading until he began to close his eyes and doze off. He fell into a deep slumber. He was now dreaming, or so he thought. In his dream, Dan could hear the crickets in the forest but was woken up by some strange steps walking around the forest and the leaves crunching beneath him or it, as if some person or animal were walking in the woods. There are a lot of cats in our neighborhood, so he thought it was one of those cats, a possum or maybe an owl. All of a sudden, he heard a low whisper that beckoned him and said, "Daniel, it's Professor X, the X-Men need your help. Come to the woods and help us." This strange but yet familiar voice was very similar to the professor's voice from his favorite cartoon, and it sounded like it was right outside his window. Since he was a naive and innocent child, he decided to get out of bed, put on his jacket and boots, took his glasses, got out of his apartment, and went to the ground floor. Once he was on the ground floor, he walked to his building's parking lot. He felt a little cold, so he rubbed his shoulders with his hands. The voice kept calling out to him, "Help the X-Men, Dan." Somehow, he felt extremely attracted to this voice, like a metal to a magnet, because he could not get it out of his head. He took a small leap to get on top of a small hill. He felt awful but kept walking into the dark and creepy woods. While he was walking, he heard other footsteps and leaves crunching beside his. He felt like these steps were approaching his position. In that moment, he stopped walking so he could hear the steps more clearly, since he thought it was some crazy person or animal that was insane enough to walk in the woods in the middle of the night. There are a lot of cats in our neighborhood, so Dan thought it was one of those cats, maybe a possum or an owl, but then he heard a noise that sounded like a roar. He thought it sounded very similar to the sounds the dinosaurs made in that movie Jurassic Park he had seen in the theater a few weeks before, and the quick steps from somebody or something running in his direction. Suddenly, Dan broke out of his trance. He looked around, and his little kid's mind felt so terrified that he passed out, and fortunately, when he fell to the ground, his body was positioned between a tall tree and a large boulder, so he barely heard how this trickster creature ran next to him, circled his location while it smelled the air in order to get his scent, but he guessed it decided to leave. Dan assumed he had passed out for several hours because he was woken up by the sound of a woodpecker, cicadas, and birds that were on a nearby tree, the heat and glare from the sun on his face. He rubbed his eyes, opened them, looked all around him, and he was in shock and felt horrified when he looked at his Spider-Man watch and saw it was 6 a.m. He had woken up in the middle of the forest. He thought he was going to wake up in his bed because he was dreaming, but he had sleepwalked inside the forest in order to follow that beckoning voice. He saw how his clothes were full of fallen leaves, so Dan quickly stood up, brushed the leaves from his arms and legs, and ran away from that creepy forest, which looked normal during the day. He climbed down the forest until he got to his parking lot. He ran to his building's door, opened it, and ran into the elevator. He saw himself in the mirror and could not believe what had happened to him. Dan got to his apartment's door. He opened the door silently, tiptoed inside his apartment's hallway, and saw that, thankfully, his mother had not woken up yet, since she would never believe what had happened, so he went to bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had occurred last night. Now he completely believed his parents when they told him not to talk or listen to strangers, especially if they are in the middle of a dark and creepy forest. So, Dan had so many questions and thought to himself, how did this creature imitate Professor X's voice? How did it know I would listen to it? How did they know I loved the X-Men cartoon? Maybe he would never find out, or maybe he would, who knows? It was 30 minutes past legal sunset. Darkness descended into the hardwoods, filling the valleys first, then topping the ridges. The golden hour had come and gone, and I hadn't seen a single deer that evening hunt. I was 13, and it was my first season hunting alone. Up until this point, I had always been with my father or an older sibling. I stood up from the blowdown I had been sitting on, cleared my firearm, a Marlin 30-30, put it on safe, and slung it over my shoulder, prepping for the half-mile walk back to our camp set up on the next ridge. I had a 200-yard walk through the forest, down the ridge I was on, to an old logging road at the base of the next ridge. From there, just follow the road up the hill to our camp on top of the ridge. I remember the first part of the walk being uneventful. I made it down the hill with no problem. Cedar trees choked both sides of the logging road, springing up to claim the sunlight provided by an unexpected break in the canopy. Once I reached the cedar thicket, I knew the road was only a few yards ahead of me. By this time, I had fished the small flashlight out of my pack. It wasn't much of a light, but it would cast enough light to keep me from tripping over anything or rolling an ankle. When I reached the cedar trees, that's the first time I heard the high-pitched laughter coming from the ridge behind me. I wheeled around, scanning the woods with my flashlight, the beam only reaching a dozen yards or so. It was like no other sound I had heard. I had no explanation for it. My brain decided it was my father pulling a prank. That's what I told myself as I reached the road and started the uphill walk back to camp. That's when I heard it again, a high-pitched cackle. This time, Further up the ridge, 100 yards from where I had heard it last time. Way too far for someone to have walked in the time allowed. The idea of a prank quickly left my mind. Visions of devils and demons filled my brain. Blair Witch maybe? At this point, the 30-30 was off my shoulder and in my right hand, feeble light still in my left, guiding my way. The high-pitched laughing cackle continued as I trudged up the hill, always changing locations, seeming to never be in the same place twice, always changing positions, always close, but never close enough for me to see the source of the noise. Every time it sounded, I got goosebumps on my body. My hair stood on end, and I became more and more frightened. I jacked around into my 30-30 and continued to walk, a little faster pace this time. As the cackling continued, I picked up the pace and took the safety off of my lever-action rifle. By the time I was nearing camp, I had the hammer eared back on my firearm and was almost jogging up the logging road, flashlight swinging back and forth, trying to spot the source of this menacing cackle. As I neared the top of the ridge, I started to feel safer as I saw the glow of the campfire surrounded by the headlamps of my father and his friends. The cackling laughter seemed to sense the presence of more seasoned men and started to lag behind, staying in the depths of the forest, not coming closer to the camp. Once in the light of the fire, I stopped to catch my breath and took the time to clear my firearm once again. The cackling laughter could barely be heard now, moving back into the forest. Soon, it fades out to nothing. I acted as normal as I could, going about getting dinner, hanging out by the fire. It wasn't until I had my father alone later that evening that I told him what I had experienced. With a little sideways smirk and a kindly hand on my shoulder, he explained everything I ever needed to know about barred owls and the variety of noises they can make. Crazy woods encounter. I'd like to start off by saying my parents live on a plantation in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. I won't say specifically where due to privacy. Growing up, it was me and my brother, who is 4 years older than me, and he's still my best friend to this day. My dad was a farmer, so I and my brother both grew up with a love for the outdoors and adventure. We have over 7,000 acres and a total of 6 barns. My grandparents owned this land before my father inherited it. They owned slaves, and my grandfather treated them all well and even built a small community for them behind our barn so they would be close by in case they were needed. It's the 21st century, so we had no slaves. We had upgraded to farmhands by this point, when I was a kid. I was 6 years old at the time of this encounter, and my brother was 10. My mother had just passed, and it was just us 3 left. We were out one day exploring the barn. My dad was out in the fields tilling to prepare for the crops we had coming in. We eventually arrived at the community, approximately 2 miles away from our house, which was made up of 7 houses nestled in the woods. By this time they were overgrown and underkept due to their lack of tenants who were in charge of upkeep. To give you a bit of insight into how these looked, I will try my best to give a brief explanation. They were all wooden houses, 1 story, of course, with a small porch and a large wooden door. They had 2 windows on each side of the front door and windows all along the sides, all broken. The grass was waist high, and the tree limbs had broken into the windows, and some had even grown into the side of one of the houses. My brother was carrying a machete to chop away some of the undergrowth so we could get to them. We entered the front house that was a bit bigger than the rest with tin on the roof and a brick chimney. The steps broke under our feet, and my brother had to help me climb up. The porch had almost completely rotted by this point. I'm not a tall girl, and my legs are especially short, making high cabinets and big steps difficult for me, even now. My brother went first, opening the door with a heavy kick from the wood being warped and disfigured. He shut the door as best he could behind us. We entered the house to see most of the floor was missing, revealing grass and even small trees growing through the floor. Rodents scattered in every direction, making me yelp, but my brother just laughed. There was a mattress to the left whose springs were the only thing remaining. All of a sudden, we heard a loud crack right outside the door, causing both of us to freeze where we were. My brother whispered that it was likely a deer and advised us to remain extremely quiet so we could see him clearly. We both slowly crept over to one of the windows to try to see outside and catch the deer. We both had a love for animals and enjoyed watching them. As we reached the window, we heard very hushed voices, and I very distinctly remember the deep growl of one of the voices telling the other, "Shut up." I don't know where the duck they went, but I swear to God when we find them, I'll kill all of them. I don't ducking care. I'll kill them before I go to jail. Then he erupted into manic laughter that echoed through the woods. I remember the look on my brother's face. I knew he was terrified. My brother was only 10 at the time, but he was almost 6 feet, and almost nothing scared him. If he was scared, I knew I should be. He whispered that I should crouch down to hide from the window's view. I crept down next to a rotten couch that reeked of decay. The smell alone made me gag. Tears were spilling out of my eyes, and I kept my hands over my mouth to keep my sobs quiet. I bit down so hard on my hand I remember tasting blood. My brother was peering over the side of the window, his face white. I heard limbs breaking as the trespassers made their way toward every house to find us. I remember thanking God that my brother had shut the door. He motioned me to come towards him, and I slowly crept to where he was, trying to make as little noise as possible. He told me he was going to open the door, and when he did that, I needed to run all the way back to the house and try to find Dad. He kept nudging me towards the door, and he was getting frustrated when I wouldn't move. I heard one of the men tell the other one to check the big building, and my heart froze. The house we were in was significantly bigger than the others, and I knew they were coming for us. We heard sticks snapping from every direction, and in my child's mind, I knew we were going to die. Nothing is scarier than thinking you're going to die at such a young age. I was absolutely terrified. I was behind my brother against the wall, and he was holding my hand. I remember how sweaty his shaking hand was and how fast his heart was beating. He had the machete brandished like some sword in a sci-fi movie, and I almost chuckled at the sight, as scared as I was. The door to the house was kicked open, and there stood 4 men about 6 feet or so in height. They all looked like they hadn't bathed in years, and I could smell them from where we were standing. They smelled of rotten meat and body odor. Their teeth were yellowing, some missing, and they looked like they had been beat up, covered in bruises and blood. The blonde guy in the front was the first to speak. His voice still terrifies me to this day. "Well, look what we have here. A knight in shining ducking armor and a goddamn princess," he laughed. My brother spoke in the deepest voice he could manage. "This is my dad's land. You better get out of here. He's got guns, and he'll shoot you. He knows where we are." The blonde guy chuckled, shaking his head, and took a step towards us. The next thing he said chilled me to my core. "Your daddy can't save you. No one can. I'm your god now," he said as he took another step towards us. He looked over at me, and my blood went cold. He smiled, and I could see he only had one front tooth and only a few were left in his menacing smile. "I love pretty blonde girls. I'd love to take you with me. My own pretty little girl. I've always wanted a little girl," I cried out and buried my face into my brother's back as I wept, screaming for my dad. "Daddy can't save you now," he screamed, and my brother lunged towards the guy and swung the machete as hard as he could, almost knocking himself over from its weight. All 3 of the guys started laughing maniacally. My brother stepped closer to the men swinging the machete again, coming inches from the blonde guy's face. He leaned back to avoid the blow and started laughing louder. The sound was like something out of the most awful horror movie. I could hear the cracking in their voices. Their smiles made it all the more worse. All 3 of the men were in the house with us now, and the lanky, black-haired guy shut the door behind him. They kept inching closer to us, and my brother was telling me to stay behind him as he kept the machete pointed towards them. Then, the most heavenly sound. Out of nowhere we heard a truck horn, and my heart jumped into my throat. The road leading to the community was maybe 200 yards from the house with a few trees between it. The guys went stock straight and bolted out the door. One of their legs fell through the floor, but he quickly yanked it out and bolted. We looked out to see my dad and cousins jumping out of his truck with their guns in hand. They fired a few shots, missing the guys by inches. My dad ran into the house and scooped me up. My brother was crying, and my dad was too. He hugged me and my brother so tight that day. My dad never let us go near the community again and only let us go into the barns if he was with us. He told me recently he thought we were dead already, and he will never be happier than the day he found us alive. As for the guys, after my dad and cousins arrived, they bolted deeper into the woods, and my cousins pursued them but gave up after a mile or so. My cousin still swears he shot one of them in the leg, but it was never confirmed. My dad told my brother he was coming to the barn for a drink and to rest for a minute. He heard my screams, and they immediately followed them to us. My brother and I both received intense counseling for the next few months afterwards. I'm 22 years old, and I still wake up in a panic, reliving the worst day of my life with those awful men. I am so thankful for my brother for doing his best to keep me alive. I'm even more thankful for my dad and cousins and that they had given the fields a rest even if just for a moment. God only knows what would have happened to us had they not shown up. It scares me to this day to think about it. To the men in the woods, please, let's never, ever meet again. Figure in the trees. I have been babysitting since I was 11 years old and absolutely loved it. I would babysit any chance I had and soon was in pretty high demand in my area. One summer, when I was about 15, I was looking for more permanent work and received an offer to be a nanny for 2 children a few days a week. It paid well, and I loved the children. The little girl, let's call her Jenna, was sweet and adorable, content to tag along with whatever her older brother, we will call him Josh, wanted to do. He was energetic, very curious, and sometimes a little rebellious, but nothing too extreme. Their home was essentially located at the base of the mountains. There were neighbors up and down the road, but the towering pine and aspen trees around the house made it feel isolated. Their backyard bled into the national forest. There was nothing after their home except the miles of trees and some back trails. One day I was preparing lunch in the kitchen. The children were only a few feet down from me standing at one of their screen doors. Their father was in the process of putting in steps for this door, so there was nothing beyond it except a 2-foot drop to the grass, which only went a couple yards or so before meeting the trees. It made it seem you were looking right out of the house into the heart of the forest. A few minutes earlier, I had shown them how they could yell or make funny noises out the screen door and would hear their voices echoing back to them. As I prepared lunch, they continued to call, howl, and trill only to dissolve into giggles as they heard the sounds coming back to them. I was at the kitchen sink, cutting strawberries, chuckling at their increasingly silly noises. Then I noticed that they had become quieter, listening more intently after they had called out. I paused and asked them what they were doing. They did not hear, but Josh proceeded to let out a loud yee-ha-ow-ow sound. I heard it echo a couple of times, then I heard something else, a voice, drifting through the trees, making the exact same noise back. Confused, wondering if I was just hearing a distorted echo, I put down the knife and strode over to stand behind the children. Just then Jenna let out a howl like a wolf. Sure enough, a couple of minutes later I heard a different voice making the same sound in repose. I scanned the trees but could see no one. At this point a prickle of unease crept through me. It was possible it was one of the neighbor's kids, but I still could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told the children it was time to stop and to shut the door, but Josh, ever obstinate, let out a loud hello. Again there was a quick response, closer than the others. At this point their dog, Sky, was barking and growling at the door. She is a very sweet dog, and I had never seen her like this. Her hair was standing on edge, staring fixedly out into the trees with her lips curling. More out of instinct than reason, I opened the door. In an instant she shot off into the trees, snarling and barking. As I followed her path, I saw something that made my blood freeze over. There was a figure standing among the trees, maybe 40 feet from us. Too large to be a child and not the right build for a woman. He wore a green hoodie that was almost the same shade as the floor around him, the hood pulled up over his head. The moment Sky came lunging at him, he quickly whirled around and started running back in the opposite direction. Heart pounding in my chest, I pulled the children back and shut the door, locking it. I am not sure how I managed to put a smile on my face and tell the children to go get their plates for lunch. After I had finished serving them, I stationed myself at the door, staring out into the forest, eyes darting to catch any movement. Plans rapidly fired through my head. Where we could hide in the house, where the house phone was, what I could use as a weapon. What felt like an eternity later, Sky came back, tail wagging, tongue lolling. She looked so pleased with herself. I let her in once again, locking that door and all the other doors in the house. The rest of the day went by without incident, though I could never fully relax. Sky never showed any sign anything was amiss. I told their mother when she got home, but she only frowned and went, but never said anything else. I continued to tend to them for the rest of the summer and never had anything like this happen again. I sometimes looked out into the trees around the house and wondered who the man was and what he was planning. I would quickly put it out of my mind because if I didn't, I would start to feel cold panic sweep over me. I still tend children and am almost done with college and child development. I will be tending children for a living. Still, my greatest fear is that someday something, or someone, will hurt the children under my care. I can only pray that the day never comes. Whispers in the Pines. I'm from a strange town. My experience at this recreational resort years ago altered my opinion of it. As I got out of my car, the promise of relaxation blended with the smell of pine needles, filling my lungs with the cool fall air. Nestled in the middle of the dense forest, the Moonlight Pines resort enticed with its promises of peace and escape. It appeared to be the ideal retreat from the pressures of daily life, a peaceful haven surrounded by the embrace of nature. Towering pine trees line the driveway of the resort's majestic entrance, their branches extending like old fingers, ready to tell me stories about the secrets of the forest. Ahead, the main lodge's architecture blended in perfectly with the surrounding landscape. The large oak doors opened as I got closer, exposing a cozy, welcoming interior. Emily, a kind receptionist, gave me a brass key on a tiny keychain in the shape of a pine cone. Sir, room 237. It is located on the second level with a view of the forest. Have a great day while visiting Moonlight Pines. I grinned and thanked her before making my way to the elevator. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched when the doors closed, but I wrote it off as a figment of my hyperactive mind. The second-floor corridor was poorly lit, creating unsettling shadows on the walls. As I inserted the key, the door of room 237 creaked open, showing a comfortable and tastefully furnished suite. The expansive window provided a stunning view of the pine forest below, with the waving branches glowing ethereally in the moonlight. Moonlight Pines had a quiet first night. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees lulled me to sleep. But as the days passed, I started to feel a little uneasy. As though the woodland itself had secrets it wanted to reveal, the mood changed from peaceful to tense. The trees seemed to speak in a language that only they could understand one evening as I walked around the resort's vast grounds. The wind carried the chilling words that I couldn't understand. I tried to dismiss it as a hallucination, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The room seemed oppressive as I lay in bed that night. While the wind outside howled like a mourning spirit, shadows danced along the walls. A slight tapping sounded in the room as I was ready to write it all off as paranoia. It seemed to emanate from the window and was rhythmic and purposeful. I walked reluctantly up to the window and drew back the heavy drapes. The moonlit forest welcomed me, yet something seemed strange. Silently, black creatures walked among the trees, their shapes shifting like shadows. I started to panic and staggered back, my heart pounding. I decided to investigate the resort the following day in an attempt to get answers. Once a place of tranquility, Moonlight Pines now seemed like a maze of secrets. The employees' grins concealed a sense of discomfort that pervaded the atmosphere, as if they were unaware of the disturbing undercurrents. I discovered an old photograph in the resort's library while trying to make sense of everything. It was from decades ago and showed a group of folks wearing old clothes with eerily identical eyes. One of them was a man who shivered down my spine, a man who looked much like me. The old books in the library told of a long-forgotten curse that was rumored to be connected to the ground where Moonlight Pines formerly existed. According to legend, there was a vindictive spirit that had been wronged in life and was seeking revenge from anyone who tried to enter its realm. I researched the resort's past because I was determined to find the truth. As it turned out, Moonlight Pines had been constructed over the ruins of an ancient community that had long since been forgotten. The villagers had disappeared without a trace after succumbing to an unexplained illness. I was saddened to learn that the person in the picture had the same name as me, possibly a distant ancestor. It appeared as though the curse had clung to my ties to the town and encircled me with a web of evil. The days went by, and the pines' murmurs grew louder, their voices rising in loudness. The tapping on the window became constant, and shadows danced maliciously. Sleep faded into the past, to be replaced by eerie dreams that made it difficult to distinguish between nightmare and reality. I was so desperate that I turned to Mrs. Thompson, a local historian who was familiar with Moonlight Pines' mysteries. She told the sad story of a wounded spirit seeking atonement, caught in the never-ending cycle of retaliation, with a knowing look. Mrs. Thompson led me to a secret room beneath the resort, with walls decorated with ancient symbols. A sensation of dread pervaded the room, and the air was thick with the weight of the past. She explained that the restless spirit could only be at peace if it was placated, which was the only way to lift the curse. Equipped with my newfound understanding, I set out to solve the ancient village's riddles. I found a secret burial spot tucked away in the woodland, guided by the whispering in the trees. The names of the long-forgotten peasants, their souls stuck in limbo, were inscribed on the gravestones. The woodland seems to spring to life with every step, bringing up memories of a bygone era. Through the shadows, I was guided by the spirit of the wronged man in the picture, who told me a story of tragedy and treachery that had sentenced him to an eternity of suffering. I discovered the curse's true meaning in a clearing encircled by twisted trees. Centuries before, the village and its people had been doomed by a somber ceremony. Those he trusted most had deceived the ghost, who had once been a man of flesh and blood. I set out on a mission to lift the curse and release the afflicted spirits, motivated by a renewed sense of purpose. The air crackled with energy as each deliberate step was taken, guided by the ancient symbols in the hidden room. Echoing the pain of the past, the whispering in the woods intensified. The woodland quieted as the last symbol was carved onto the stone floor. The wind stopped its wailing lament, and the shadows moved back. Time itself appeared to pause for a second as a dazzling light filled the area. The woodland seemed different, invigorated, as though the curse had been lifted, until the light faded. Finally at peace, the long-lost peasant's spirits vanished into thin air. The man who had been harmed nodded and then vanished into thin air, his eyes full of thanks. The stifling atmosphere had subsided by the time they returned to Moonlight Pines. The shadows that had earlier clung to the resort's nooks withered away as the pines whispered words of appreciation. The employees, who had before been ensnared in a facade of normalcy, were now wearing sincere smiles, and their eyes showed a renewed sense of calm. Emily, the receptionist, gave me a little keychain in the shape of a pine cone when I was checking out. A thank you gift for lifting the curse, sir. Moonlight Pines will always be appreciative. She spoke with genuine honesty, and as I walked out of the resort, I heard a chorus of gratitude resonating in the pines. I looked back at Moonlight Pines as I drove away, the imposing exterior now glowing with the hope of a fresh start. Once a place of darkness, the old forest now promised rebirth. Knowing that the spell that plagued Moonlight Pines had finally been lifted made me feel a sense of success as the pines waved goodbye in the soft air. Crazy old lady. So to start this story, I'm originally from Wales, in the UK, but I moved to France during my childhood, and we settled in the south. This didn't stop us from moving around often, though, and during my childhood I lived in numerous different places in the south of France. This story takes place right after we moved to a new town, 2 hours from my previous home. As soon as we moved, I and my friends decided to go on a camping trip in a forest, 30 minutes into the countryside outside of my town. I'd like to preface this story by admitting that I wasn't completely in the right. Indeed, I made mistakes on multiple occasions. So we walked 2 hours into the countryside through the forests in the humid summer heat of the south of France. We set up our tents, drank beer, and had a nice evening as a whole. However, around 2 in the morning, we started to get bored and decided to go on a walk through the forest. Not all of us were completely happy with this, but those who didn't want to go also didn't want to be left alone, so we all began our walk through the forest. The walk was nice, we talked, laughed, and some of us were mildly tipsy but nothing crazy, and we kept up the pace quite well. After 20 minutes of walking, we came to a clearing and came out into a small village. Those of my friends who knew the area well knew this village was here, but no one expected us to find it so soon. We were all excited, given that we were bored. The little village of no more than 30 houses was going to give us something to do. We were all 14-15, so extremely immature and huge idiots. We started by trying to pull road signs out of the ground, hoping to take one back to the campsite. Then we moved on to the village primary school, where we jumped the fence and opened the door to a little shed in the playground. This is where we found little bikes, and we decided it would be a great idea to push each other down the hill on these bikes. We planned on returning these bikes, obviously, and were just having as much fun as possible. As we were putting the bikes back, that's when she appeared. I say she, but it was impossible to know the gender of this person at first given the pitch black and crappy street lights. The person exited their front door with a small dog. Now you could imagine that the person was simply walking their dog, but at 3:30 a.m., this seemed a little unbelievable. We all watched as the person walked, extremely slowly, straight in our direction. The person didn't speak a word but just wandered slowly towards us, with the dog at their feet. We were all a little creeped out, but also curious. You should remember that we're standing directly in front of the primary school, so this person has no other reason to be walking in this direction unless it comes toward us. As the figure approaches, my friends gradually lose their composure and flee. But I, needing to be the one to be the last standing, continue standing there until the person is within 6 feet of me. I still can't see the person's face, as they have their hood up, but I too lose my nerve and turn and run. I can't help wondering what would have happened if I'd stood still. She wasn't looking at me, didn't seem to have any intention of stopping, and had nothing to say. Now if the story ended here, it would simply be creepy, but nothing. However, the worst is very much yet to come. After running away, we continued to tour the village, being idiots and running around. Until we come down a street leading us straight towards the creepy person's house, from a different direction than the primary school. Now any mature human being would simply walk away and stay far away from this house, but being the idiotic teenage boys we were, we dared each other to knock. We played rock paper scissors, and of course I lost. I approached the door slowly, knocked gently, and bolted down the street. Nothing. After 5 minutes of hiding and giggling, no reaction. So we engaged in another round of rock paper scissors, and lo and behold, I lost again. So I approached the door for a second time, my heart beating a little faster than before, my hands shaking a little more than the first time. I knock a little harder this time, and with a tingle of fear that runs down my neck, I turn and bolt down the street. Realizing this would surely be enough to wake someone up, my friends exit their hiding places, and we bolt down the village's main street toward the village's exit. However, this road was long and wide, and we remained in view of the house as we were running away. This is when I turned. And there she was. Stood directly under the lamppost outside her house. Staring directly at us. Saying nothing. We were about 50 feet away at this point, so all I could make out was her gray hair. Realizing we'd been caught, we ran even faster until we were nearing the right turn onto the main road that led out of the village. But as we neared the turning, we slowed to see what she was doing. She slowly turned, and at a speed we hadn't yet seen her move and didn't even realize she was capable of moving it given the speed she was moving at earlier. She bolted back into her house. This made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I would never have expected this little old lady to move at that speed. But what she did next still terrifies me to this day. She comes running out of her house towards her small car, which is sitting in front of her house, and I can just barely make out the outline of something. A hunter's rifle. Now gun laws in France are tight, but hunting is the exception, and in these parts of the southern countryside, almost everyone owned one. At this point, I'd understood what was about to happen, and I saw her open her car door and get in. I screamed to my friends, who had already made the turn, to run. At first they didn't understand, but when they heard the faint sound of a car starting, I watched all their faces drop. We ran like we'd never run before down the main road, with houses and front gardens on the left and huge dense bushes on the right. We all ran to the left, jumped the fence of a house, and lay down on the ground. Saved. Or were we? The second we lay down, a man, on his way to his early job, came out the front door. He looked us up and down and shouted at us to get out. So we did. As we made our way back onto the road and exited the garden to continue our run, we suddenly became aware of something. It was the last lamppost and the last house. As we looked down the street, two huge dense bushes enveloped each side of the road, and it led into the pitch black of nothingness. No houses, no lights, no buildings, just road. There was no escape. And that's when we heard it. The faint rumble of a car engine. I'd always thought that fight or flight and adrenaline were exaggerated in stories like these, until that moment. Everything slowed down, I didn't move, I didn't even remember how to move. And as all my friends rushed to the right side of the road, throwing themselves desperately into the bush to try and break through, I stayed frozen. That is, until I felt the headlights of a car turning in the distance. It struck me into action, and as my friends tried desperately to hide on the right, I made the terrified decision to try the left. I could feel the car getting closer, but it was still pitch black. I felt around the bush, the adrenaline taking control, hoping desperately that I'd find a way through. And that's when I felt it. It was a cold, metal bar. A fence bar. I grabbed it and launched myself over the fence, off of the road onto the ground below. I didn't even have time to roll away from the fence when the car stopped. She'd seen my friends on the right, breaking through the bush, and luckily, they just about managed to. She got out of the car, headlights off, and suddenly, everything was pitch black. However, she was so preoccupied by my friends, she couldn't see me, inches away from her legs on the other side of the fence. My breathing ceased. I lay there, terrified that she'd turn around. But she didn't. What she did was far more terrifying. She lifted the gun and fired a warning shot. The sound was deafening, and I genuinely thought I was going to die. But that wasn't the worst of it. What happened next still haunts me to this day. She looked up to the sky and screamed. Not an angry shout or an insult. She just full-on screamed for 30 seconds, as my heart skipped numerous beats. I could touch her. I was within touching distance of her. Her screaming was almost superhuman, one of those terrifying, psychotic screams. She then flung open the door, threw herself back into the car, and drove full speed away. I was paralyzed, and the last of my friends built up the courage to move. I never thought I'd move again. Until I felt them pull me up from the other side of the gate. That was it for us, and as we walked back along the road, terrified we'd see her car again, none of us spoke. None of us could speak. I learned the next day that one of my friends never made it through the bush, that he was lying in the ditch on the right side of the road, and that if she hadn't been on the side of the car that she was in, she would have been looking straight at him. It's safe to say that I never ding-dong ditched again. And to the old woman, please never come near me again.